You're listening to True Crime for Sleeping. If you enjoy these calm retellings, please consider liking, subscribing, and letting us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. In the quiet sprawl of Anchorage, Alaska, winter has a way of swallowing sound. Snow softens every step, and the cold keeps people indoors. On most nights in February, the city sleeps under a blanket of silence broken only by the hum of streetlights and the faint moan of wind sweeping down from the mountains. It was into this landscape, on February 1st, 2012, that an unease began to grow. 19-year-old Samantha Koenig didn't come home from her evening shift at the Common Grounds coffee stand, a small kiosk in a busy part of town. Her father, James, knew something was wrong almost immediately. Samantha was responsible, cautious, and close to her family. She wasn't the type to vanish. When her boyfriend stopped by the stand just before closing that night, he saw something that made his stomach twist. The coffee stand was locked, lights were off, and Samantha was gone. Security footage, when it was pulled, would later reveal a chilling scene, a man wearing a ski mask, speaking to Samantha. At first she looked calm, as though it was a routine order. Then her body language changed. He produced a weapon. She complied, turning off the lights, moving as he instructed. They left together, fading into the darkness. It was a kidnapping, but it wasn't random, and it wasn't the work of someone who had acted on impulse. The man behind it was Israel Keys, a name that at that point meant nothing to Anchorage police. He had no obvious connection to Samantha, no criminal record that matched the precision of the abduction, and no local footprint that tied him to the crime. Keys was unlike most serial killers in one crucial way. He didn't hunt close to home. He moved through the country like a ghost, leaving caches of weapons, rope, duct tape, and other tools of abduction buried in remote locations, sometimes years before he used them. That night, Samantha Koenig became part of a meticulously planned crime. After forcing her into his truck, Keys took her to his home, a modest, nondescript house he shared with his girlfriend and her child. They were away on vacation, a detail he had planned to coincide with his crime. In the days after Samantha's disappearance, Anchorage was gripped with fear. Flyers appeared on every corner. Volunteers searched frozen parks and wooded trails, social media filled with desperate pleas for her safe return. But Keys was in no rush. He was calculating, deliberate, and cold. While Samantha's father went on television to beg for her life, Keys attended to his own errands, including making plans for a trip to Texas. He left Alaska on February 2nd, the morning after the kidnapping, and spent over 2 weeks in the lower 48, as if nothing had happened. When he returned to Anchorage in mid-February, Samantha had been dead for days. Keys had killed her within hours of the abduction, a detail he would confess later. But his plan didn't end there. On February 24th, Samantha's family received a ransom note, a Polaroid photo showing Samantha, apparently alive, sitting against a white backdrop. She held that day's Anchorage Daily News, and the note demanded $30,000 to be deposited into her account. Her family clung to hope. The image was clear, her face still familiar, despite exhaustion. They didn't know the truth. Keys had staged the photo after her death. He had thawed her body from a shed where it had been kept in the frigid winter air, applied makeup to her face to mask the reality, and posed her for the picture. For the Koenig family, those weeks were a cycle of hope and terror. For Keys, they were part of a carefully constructed game. He had no personal connection to Samantha, no vendetta against her or her family. She was a target of opportunity, chosen simply because she was there, alone, and her workplace provided a setting he could control. Police, working with the FBI, traced the ransom money as withdrawals were made in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Surveillance footage showed a man in a white mask and hooded sweatshirt at ATM machines, using Samantha's debit card. Each time he was driving a white Ford Focus, a rental car. The trail finally broke open in Texas on March 13, 2012. A state trooper noticed a car matching the description at a hotel parking lot in Lufkin. Keys was inside, his demeanor calm, his answers measured, but inside the vehicle, investigators found Samantha's debit card, her cell phone, and the mask from the ATM footage. His arrest ended Samantha's story, but it was only the beginning of what the FBI would learn. Keyes was not a man who had killed once. In interviews after his capture, he spoke with an unsettling detachment, revealing a life built around hidden crimes. He admitted to murders across the United States, though he refused to give details on many of them. He had no set victim type. He had killed men, women, couples, whoever fit the moment and the place. He traveled frequently, choosing locations far from home, ensuring his victims were strangers. His caches, buried buckets containing weapons, cash and supplies, were placed in advance, sometimes years before. This allowed him to arrive in a city and within hours, have everything he needed to abduct and kill without purchasing suspicious items locally. Keyes was methodical. He avoided patterns. He chose remote locations for bodies, sometimes burning them, sometimes sinking them in lakes. He didn't drink or use drugs while committing his crimes. He was disciplined, careful, and frighteningly self-controlled. To the FBI, this made him one of the most dangerous types of killers, one without a psychological signature that linked his crimes together. But beneath the cold precision was a mind shaped by years of isolation and secrecy. Keyes had grown up in a strict survivalist family in rural Washington, far removed from mainstream society. His upbringing was marked by religious extremism, distrust of authority, and a kind of off-grid self-reliance that fed his sense of separateness from the rest of the world. By the time he was in his 20s, he had already committed crimes he would never fully disclose. The FBI suspected, and still suspects, that his total number of victims was far higher than the 3 confirmed cases tied to him. In the months after his arrest, agents pressed him for details, trying to link him to missing persons cases and unsolved murders nationwide. Sometimes he offered small pieces of information, a location, a vague description, before shutting down. He enjoyed the control, even in custody. For the Koenig family, the reality was devastating. They had been pulled into a nightmare not just because of a killer's violence, but because of his deliberate, calculated cruelty. And yet, as the FBI learned more, it became clear that Samantha's case was unusual in one regard. Keyes had never before demanded ransom. For most of his crimes, he took no souvenirs, sent no messages, and left no room for negotiation. The ransom was simply a way to withdraw money without drawing suspicion, and to extend the time before he was caught. The more they learned about him, the more frightening the truth became. Israel Keyes had been killing for years, and nobody knew. When FBI agents sat across from Israel Keyes in the Anchorage Police Department's interview room, they expected arrogance, defiance, maybe even outbursts of anger. Instead, they found a man who spoke softly, often smiling faintly, his posture relaxed, his words measured. It wasn't bravado, it was control. From the moment of his arrest in Texas on March 13, 2012, Keyes acted as though he had been rehearsing this moment for years. He didn't rush to deny anything, nor did he confess outright. Instead, he treated each question like a chess move, weighing, pausing, giving just enough to keep his interrogators engaged, but never enough to let them feel in control. The FBI quickly realized that Samantha Koenig's murder was not an isolated crime. Within days of questioning, Keyes admitted that she wasn't his first victim, but he would not say how many had come before. "We're talking about a lot more than just this case," one agent said in an early interview. Keyes simply nodded. What emerged over the following weeks was the chilling outline of a criminal career unlike any the Bureau had seen in years. Most serial killers operate within a familiar hunting ground. They choose cities they know, neighborhoods where they can blend in, and victims who fit a type: young women, children, sex workers, or people living on the margins. This predictability is often what allows law enforcement to connect the dots between cases. Keyes rejected all of that. He traveled extensively, sometimes thousands of miles from home, just to commit a crime. He might fly into one city, rent a car, and drive hundreds of miles to a completely different state to find his victim. He avoided any connection between his home in Alaska and his crimes. The FBI would later learn that Keyes had traveled to places like Vermont, New York, Washington, Texas, and even as far south as Mexico. In many cases, the people he targeted had no warning and no possible way to suspect they were in danger. His method was disturbingly simple. He prepared long before the killing. In remote areas, sometimes national parks, sometimes private land far from the public eye, he buried what he called murder kits. These were 5-gallon buckets filled with guns, ammunition, rope, duct tape, and bottles of Drano for destroying evidence. Some kits remained buried for years before he retrieved them. Others were dug up within months. Each time, the location was chosen for its isolation and its distance from any place that could be tied to him. One FBI agent later described it as a spider building webs in every corner of the country. One of the first crimes Keyes admitted to, aside from Samantha Koenig's murder, was a double killing in Vermont in 2011. He told investigators he had flown from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and driven over 1,000 miles to a small town called Essex. There, he retrieved a murder kit he had buried 2 years earlier. He spent days scouting neighborhoods before choosing a house at random. In the early hours of June 8th, he broke into the home of Bill and Lorraine Courier, a middle-aged couple with no enemies and no reason to fear anyone. He subdued them at gunpoint, forced them into their own car, and drove them to an abandoned farmhouse. What happened next, he would describe with a calm detachment that unnerved even seasoned investigators. He tied them up in separate rooms. Lorraine fought back, clawing at her restraint, screaming, but Keyes had anticipated resistance. He attacked Bill first, killing him quickly before returning to Lorraine. She did not survive the night. Keyes then left the scene, abandoning their car in another location. Their bodies were never recovered. By the time police searched the farmhouse weeks later, it had been demolished. For the FBI, this confession was both a breakthrough and a frustration. They had linked Keyes to a double homicide, but without the bodies, without physical evidence, the case would remain incomplete. Keyes claimed that months, sometimes years, would pass between his killings. During those times, he lived a life so ordinary that even those closest to him had no idea. In Anchorage, he was a small business owner, running a construction company. He was a father to a young daughter, attending her school events, taking her camping. His neighbors saw him as quiet but polite. If there were rumors, they were of the mild sort, that he kept to himself, that he liked to work with his hands, that he wasn't much of a talker. When investigators interviewed people from his past, they heard a similar story. Keyes could be charming when he wanted to be. He was intelligent, methodical, and capable of blending into almost any environment. But there was also a coldness, a kind of detachment that in hindsight seemed unsettling. One former girlfriend described him as someone who could turn off his feelings like a switch. At the time she thought it was just emotional reserve. Now she wondered if it was something far darker. In his interviews, Keyes refused to give names of most of his victims. Sometimes he hinted at details, only to pull back. He told agents he had killed less than a dozen people, but they suspected the real number was higher. He admitted to at least one murder in New York, another in Washington state, and several more that could not be pinned to a specific location. Some victims, he said, were buried, others were left in water. "I have a lot more stories to tell," he said once, leaning back in his chair, "but they're mine until I decide otherwise." He treated the confessions as bargaining chips. In exchange for more information, he wanted certain conditions: media silence, protection of his daughter from public attention, and control over the timing of his disclosures. He seemed to take satisfaction in controlling what others knew about him, even as he sat in a jail cell. FBI profilers described Keyes as organized to the point of obsession. Unlike many killers driven by compulsion or rage, Keyes killed because he wanted to, and only when the conditions were perfect. He didn't stalk a victim for weeks. Instead, he chose at random from people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This randomness made him harder to catch. There was no pattern, no victim type, no geographic cluster. Even his upbringing, while unusual, did not fit neatly into the mold of other killers. Born in Utah in 1978, he was raised in a strict, isolated household by parents who rejected mainstream culture. The family lived without electricity for years, moving between remote areas in Washington state. They were deeply religious, attending churches that blended fundamentalist Christianity with anti-government beliefs. By his teenage years, Keyes had already decided he did not believe in God, but he kept that from his family. He spent his youth exploring the forests and rivers near his home, learning to hunt and track. He developed a fascination with weapons, particularly guns and knives. When he joined the US Army in 1998, he was described by fellow soldiers as quiet but competent. He drank heavily at times, but there was no overt sign of violence. If anything, he seemed disciplined, capable of following orders, and committed to staying fit. It was after leaving the army that his criminal life escalated. He opened his construction business in Alaska, traveled frequently, and began burying his kits. While Keyes admitted to many killings, Samantha Koenig's case remained the one that drew the most attention, partly because of the way it intersected with his capture, and partly because of the cruelty of its staging. After killing her on the night of the abduction, Keyes left her body in a shed outside his house. The winter cold kept it preserved while he flew to Texas for a cruise with his girlfriend and daughter, a family trip booked long before he had even chosen Samantha as a target. Upon his return, he thawed her body, applied makeup to hide the discoloration, and sewed her eyelids open before taking the ransom photograph. To the Koenig family, that image had been a sign of hope. To Keyes it was a tool, a way to extract money while playing with their emotions. It was this blend of planning, patience, and complete lack of empathy that made him such a dangerous killer. He didn't simply want to kill, he wanted to orchestrate the aftermath. By April 2012, the FBI had a task force dedicated solely to Keyes. They combed through missing persons cases across the United States, looking for patterns that might match his travels. One confirmed link was to the disappearance of a woman in New York State in 2009. Keyes hinted that her body had been placed in a location where nobody's ever going to find it. He gave no name, no specifics. The frustrating truth was that Keyes seemed to enjoy watching investigators scramble for connections. He dribbled out facts, sometimes truthful, sometimes misleading. He was in complete control of the pace. The more they learned, the clearer it became there could be victims in states from coast to coast, and many would never be found. Under the dim light of the Alaskan winter, Anchorage was a city caught between extremes, brutal cold, and the warm familiarity of small community life. In early 2012, most residents went about their routines wrapped in thick coats, their lives revolving around work, home, and the occasional stop at one of the city's quiet coffee shops. For Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old working at a local coffee kiosk, that January and February were meant to be a time of saving money, making plans and thinking about the future. She was young, lively, and liked by many who knew her. But in the shadow of the ordinary, a man named Israel Keyes was watching. By the time he crossed paths with Samantha, Israel Keyes had already lived years as a hidden predator. He didn't hunt in one location, or even one state. His movements were calculated, unpredictable, and spread across vast distances. He had a life that looked ordinary on the surface, a business owner, a father, someone who kept up a quiet profile. Yet his life's darkest hours were planned with meticulous attention, with kill kits buried in secluded spots, ready to be used whenever he chose to strike. On the night of February 1st, 2012, Samantha was closing the coffee stand alone. The evening had been typical, customers stopping by for lattes and mochas, the sound of cars passing on the nearby road, the cold air seeping into the small space every time the window opened. Around 8 p.m., a man approached the window, his face partially obscured by a ski mask. At first, Samantha thought it might be a prank or a customer braving the cold, but when he produced a gun and ordered her to turn off the lights, the reality sank in. Security cameras captured pieces of what happened. Samantha complied, her fear barely contained as she was forced out of the kiosk and into the freezing night. Keyes led her toward his truck. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that he had scoped out the stand before that night, or that he had already planned where he would take her. It was not a crime of sudden opportunity. It was something he had prepared for. Keyes brought her back to his home. His girlfriend and young daughter were away on vacation, leaving the house quiet and empty except for the man and his captive. In the hours that followed, Samantha was tied up in a shed behind the house, while Keyes went inside, turned on the radio, and carried out parts of his normal routine. That separation between his everyday life and his hidden brutality was part of what allowed him to avoid suspicion for so long.
What happened to Samantha in the following hours was never fully shared in every detail publicly, but investigators later pieced together enough to understand the grim truth. Keyes knew from the beginning that she would not survive, but before killing her, he left the house the next day to board a flight for New Orleans. He went on a cruise to Mexico with his family, carrying himself as if nothing were amiss. Samantha's body was left in the shed, in the freezing Alaskan winter, as her family and friends launched desperate searches and news outlets picked up the story of the missing teenager. The investigation into Samantha's disappearance was immediate and intense. Her boyfriend was questioned, as is often standard in missing person cases, and the police began working through her last known movements. But the case was complicated by the fact that she appeared to have been taken without leaving much behind. No obvious struggle, no clear witnesses. Anchorage residents followed updates anxiously, hoping for any sign she might be alive. While Keyes was away, the Koenig family clung to the hope of her safe return. They plastered flyers across the city and coordinated with volunteers. Her father made emotional public appeals, asking anyone who might know where she was to come forward. What they didn't know was that their daughter's killer was sunbathing on a cruise deck thousands of miles away, calmly blending into the crowd. When Keyes returned to Anchorage in late February, he knew the attention on the case was growing. The story had become front-page news locally, with national outlets beginning to pick it up. Rather than cut ties with the crime, he decided to use it for financial gain. He retrieved Samantha's body from the shed, thawed it enough to pose her, and took a Polaroid photo to make her appear alive. This photograph was included in a ransom note he left in a local park, demanding $30,000 in exchange for her safe return. The note was discovered by a man walking his dog, who handed it over to the police. The Koenig family complied with the demand, depositing money into Samantha's account as instructed, but Keyes had no intention of bringing her back. By then she was already gone, her body hidden in a frozen lake outside of town. As the ransom money began to move, federal authorities stepped in. They monitored her account, hoping that the person accessing it would make a mistake. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. Over the following weeks, withdrawals were made from ATMs in several states, moving southward, Arizona, Texas, and then into the lower United States. Surveillance images showed a tall man in a hood, his face partially hidden, using Samantha's debit card. The FBI coordinated a multi-state effort to track the movements tied to the card. They didn't yet know who the man was, but his path was narrowing. In Texas, a routine traffic stop became the turning point. A state trooper noticed a white Ford Focus parked in an unusual location near Lufkin. The driver matched the vague descriptions from ATM footage, and his vehicle contained suspicious items, including Samantha's debit card, her phone, and a disguise. The driver was Israel Keyes. When questioned, Keyes initially gave little away. He spoke calmly, deflecting questions, maintaining control over what information he allowed to surface. But as evidence mounted, he realized the weight of the case against him. Slowly, he began to talk, not just about Samantha Koenig, but about other killings, other victims, and a web of crimes that spanned years and crossed state lines. The scope of what Keyes revealed was chilling. He admitted to flying to one state, renting a car, driving hundreds of miles to commit a murder, and then returning to his normal life without anyone suspecting. He had no clear victim profile. His victims were chosen for opportunity and circumstance. Sometimes they were couples in isolated areas, sometimes single individuals. The unpredictability was part of his design. He wanted to kill without being connected to the crime, without leaving a trail that police could easily follow. Samantha's murder, as horrifying as it was only one chapter in his history. He spoke of kill kits buried years in advance, plastic buckets filled with guns, ammunition, ropes and other tools, hidden in secluded spots like rural Vermont or remote parts of Alaska. He would fly into a city, retrieve a kit, carry out his plan, and then vanish back into the anonymity of daily life. For the investigators listening to these confessions, it was both a breakthrough and a frustration. Keyes provided enough detail to confirm certain murders, but kept many others vague, refusing to name victims or locations unless he chose to. He admitted to at least 3 confirmed murders besides Samantha, but implied there were many more, possibly over a decade's worth. His calm, almost businesslike recounting of events was deeply unsettling. Samantha Koenig's family, meanwhile, had to absorb the reality that the ransom, the notes and the hope of her safe return had all been a cruel manipulation. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that she had been gone long before they ever knew to look for her. By April 2012, the search of Matanuska Lake led to the recovery of Samantha's remains. She was brought home, and Anchorage mourned collectively. The community that had followed every update on her disappearance now came together, in vigils and memorials, holding on to the memory of her smile and spirit. Israel Keyes remained in custody, speaking to investigators in carefully measured sessions. He insisted on controlling the pace of the information he released. He seemed to take satisfaction in the idea that he alone knew the full truth. The FBI's challenge became not only to confirm his admissions, but to identify victims who had never been reported missing, or whose disappearances had long gone cold. Even in confinement, Keyes maintained his need for control. He made demands about his conditions, the timing of interviews, and the eventual fate of his case. What investigators didn't yet know was that he had no intention of letting the judicial process play out fully. That choice, too, was his to make, or so he believed. In the months following his arrest, Israel Keyes sat in an Anchorage jail cell, outwardly calm, inwardly calculating. He had been charged with the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig, and investigators were steadily building the strongest possible case. But to them, Samantha's death was only the beginning of what Keyes could reveal. They suspected there were other victims, many more, and that the quiet contractor from Alaska was hiding a long winding trail of violence that crossed the entire United States. Keyes knew this. He understood his leverage. He wasn't interested in a trial, and he wasn't interested in giving investigators everything at once. He wanted control over what information he gave, when he gave it, and to whom. It was the same control he had exercised over his victims, their fates, and the timing of each kill. Now sitting in a fluorescent-lit interrogation room with the FBI, he treated each interview like a negotiation. He would tell them, for instance, about a married couple in Vermont, Bill and Lorraine Currier, who had vanished in June 2011. He described how he had flown into Chicago, rented a car, and driven over 1,000 miles to Essex, Vermont. He had chosen them not because of who they were, but because of the location of their home. Isolated, without an attached garage, and with an accessible window. He cut the phone line, broke in, and within hours, the Curriers were gone from their lives forever. He later admitted to killing them, and disposing of their bodies in a remote abandoned farmhouse. By the time police searched the site, the building had been demolished. No trace of the couple was ever found. It was this kind of detail, specific, methodical, and almost surgically detached, that chilled even the most experienced agents. Keyes was not driven by impulse alone. He planned his crimes far in advance, often burying kill kits years before he used them. These kits were hidden in remote places, forests, secluded fields, under layers of soil and debris. They contained everything he needed: weapons, duct tape, garbage bags, cash. When the urge to kill struck him, he could travel thousands of miles, dig up a kit, and have everything ready. It made him a ghost, unconnected to his crimes, in any traditional investigative sense. The FBI soon realized that the biggest obstacle to solving his other murders was Keyes himself. He was willing to talk, but only in pieces, and only under certain conditions. He wanted his name kept out of the media, until after his death, claiming he didn't want his daughter to grow up knowing what he had done. He wanted the execution of his sentence to be swift, preferably the death penalty, and without a drawn-out trial. In exchange, he said, he would give them more names, more locations, more stories. For the families of missing persons across the country, this created a cruel tension. Every meeting with Keyes brought the possibility of closure, but also the frustration of his games. Sometimes he would give just enough detail to confirm that a victim existed, but not enough to identify them. He claimed to have killed less than a dozen people, but investigators suspected the number was higher. He admitted to murders in Washington, New York, Texas, and other states, sometimes committed during business trips, other times while traveling for pleasure. The randomness was part of his design. He didn't want patterns, he wanted to be impossible to catch. Back in Alaska, Samantha Koenig's family was left to process the aftermath of his confession. They had their answers, but no true resolution. Her father, James Koenig, had stood in front of cameras pleading for her safe return, not knowing that she had been dead before he'd even spoken those words. The ransom note, the Polaroid photo, these were not just acts of cruelty, but calculated moves, designed to keep investigators chasing shadows while Keyes enjoyed a vacation. The weight of that knowledge was heavy for her loved ones.
The city of Anchorage also struggled with the idea that someone like Keyes had lived among them unnoticed. He was a father who attended his daughter's school events, a man who worked on homes and built trust with customers. He could chat with neighbors, stand in line at the grocery store, and seem completely ordinary. That ordinariness was his camouflage. Interrogations continued into the summer and fall of 2012. The more agents spoke to him, the more they saw how his life had been compartmentalized. He had grown up in a strict, isolated household, far removed from conventional society. In his early years, he began experimenting with cruelty toward animals, setting fires and testing boundaries in ways that foreshadowed the violence to come. As a young man, he joined the army, serving for several years and gaining skills in weapons and survival. By the time he was out, he had already decided that he would live a double life, one where he could be a provider, a partner, a father, and another where he could indulge in his darkest impulses without leaving a trail. Keyes took pride in his ability to remain undetected. He told investigators that he had no connection to his victims, that he avoided killing near his home, and that he never used the same method twice. He traveled under the radar, paying in cash, avoiding security cameras whenever possible, and never taking trophies. In his mind, this made him immune to the mistakes that caught other killers. He even studied high-profile criminal cases, noting where others had gone wrong. But no one is completely invisible. His downfall had come from a chain of small miscalculations, the use of Samantha's debit card, the ATM withdrawals that painted a path across the map, the decision to stay on the road longer than he should have. Each slip had given investigators a thread, and once they had a thread, they kept pulling until the whole web began to unravel. In late 2012, Keyes began hinting that he might not give them much more. He complained about the pace of the case, about delays, about the possibility of a lengthy trial. He wanted to be done with it, and he wanted to decide when that would happen. That control, the same control he'd exercised over his victims, was slipping, and he couldn't stand it. On December 2, 2012, correctional officers making morning rounds at the Anchorage Correctional Complex found Keyes dead in his cell. He had slit his wrists and strangled himself using a bedsheet, leaving behind blood-soaked sheets and a series of handwritten notes. The notes were not confessions. They were cryptic, rambling passages that some interpreted as poetry or coded messages, but none of them contained direct admissions to his crimes or the names of his victims. It was his final act of control, taking his secrets with him. For the FBI, his death was a bitter end. They had only partial answers, and many cases remained unsolved. Families who had hoped for closure were left in limbo, knowing that the man who might have given them answers had chosen to end his life instead. The scope of his crimes remains uncertain to this day. Authorities have confirmed at least 3 murders besides Samantha Koenig's, but they suspect there were many more, scattered across states and years, each one carefully planned to leave as little trace as possible. In the years since, the name Israel Keyes has become shorthand among criminal profilers for a certain kind of killer, organized, nomadic, without a clear victim profile, and capable of blending into society with frightening ease. He is studied in law enforcement training sessions as a reminder that not all predators follow predictable patterns. For the public, his case is a chilling reminder that the person next door, the one who seems perfectly normal, may be living an entirely different life when the curtains are closed. Samantha Koenig's family continues to speak about her, keeping her memory alive through stories, photographs and community events. They want her to be remembered for her life, not just her death. In Anchorage, her case left a permanent mark on the community, changing how people think about safety, strangers, and the hidden nature of violence. For the investigators who sat across from Keyes in those interview rooms, there is still an uneasy sense that they only saw part of the picture. Somewhere out there, in forests, fields, and forgotten places, his buried kill kits may still remain, rusting quietly beneath the soil, mute reminders of crimes that may never be fully known. And in missing persons files from Alaska to the East Coast, there may be names that belong to his story, though no one will ever be able to prove it. In the end, Israel Keyes left behind an unfinished map, a scattering of points across the country, connected not by evidence but by his own chilling words. His decision to end his life ensured that most of that map would remain blank, and that perhaps was his final victory, to vanish into the dark corners of history, leaving others to search for answers he never intended to give. On a cool autumn evening in October 1989, the small coastal town of Greyhaven, Maine, had begun to retreat into its usual seasonal quiet. The summer tourists were gone, leaving only the year-round residents, fishermen, shop owners, and families who had lived in the same clapboard houses for generations. The harbor, lined with weathered boats and creaking piers, lay under a silver moonlight. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and life followed a steady rhythm. But at 8:15 p.m. on October 12th, that rhythm was broken. The last person to see 24-year-old Marissa Bell alive was her older sister, Elaine. The two had been working together that day at their family's bakery, closing up shop just as the wind began to bite off the water. Marissa had plans to stop by her friend Lila's apartment, to return a borrowed sweater, and she left on foot, saying she'd be back home before 10. She never arrived. At first, Elaine assumed her sister had decided to stay the night at Lila's, something she had done before, but when morning came and Marissa hadn't returned, the unease began to grow. By mid-afternoon, the family reported her missing. Greyhaven didn't often deal with missing persons cases. The police department consisted of a chief, 2 full-time officers, and a few part-timers. When Marissa's case landed on Chief Douglas Hart's desk, his first instinct was to think she might have simply left for a couple of days. Marissa was young, independent, and known for a spontaneous streak. But as Hart began asking questions around town, the details didn't fit that narrative. For one, Lila said she never saw Marissa that night. The sweater was never returned, and no one recalled seeing her along the streets that would have connected the bakery to Lila's place. The walk was only 15 minutes, lit by a series of old-fashioned street lamps, and Marissa was a familiar face in the neighborhood. People noticed her, her wavy brown hair, her quick smile. But on that night, she seemed to have vanished into the thin slice of darkness between her family's bakery and the waterfront. The search began in earnest on October 14th. Volunteers combed the harbor's edge, the woods just outside town, and the rocky shoreline. The fire department lent boats to search the shallow inlets, while neighbors peered into sheds and garages. By the end of the day, not a single piece of physical evidence had been found. No clothing, no personal items, no signs of a struggle. It was Lila who first mentioned something strange. She told Chief Hart that in the week before Marissa disappeared, her friend had seemed distracted. She had mentioned seeing a man hanging around near the bakery, a stranger, tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket. Marissa hadn't said he spoke to her, but she noticed him more than once, usually standing across the street, smoking, as if watching. Lila said she had teased Marissa about having a secret admirer, but Marissa hadn't laughed. "It's not like that," she had told her. "It just feels wrong." The description was vague enough to fit half the men in town, but when Hart began asking around, no one could place a stranger matching it. There were no reports of drifters or hitchhikers, and in Greyhaven, unfamiliar faces tended to stand out. Still, the idea of an outsider lurking near Marissa's workplace unsettled the community. As the days passed, the search widened. The Maine State Police sent a team to assist, bringing in dogs and specialized divers. The dogs picked up Marissa's scent briefly near the intersection where the bakery's street met the main road toward the harbor, but from there it vanished, as though she had stepped off the earth. Rumors began to swirl. Some whispered about an old local legend that the cliffs beyond Greyhaven were cursed, a place where people had disappeared for over a century. Others wondered if she had run away intentionally, though those who knew Marissa dismissed it quickly. She had a close relationship with her family, no known financial troubles, and she had just started dating a man named Owen Carver, a fisherman who docked his boat in the harbor. Owen was interviewed repeatedly. He had been out at sea on the night of Marissa's disappearance, returning early the next morning to hear the news. By all accounts, he was devastated, but Hart knew better than to rule out someone close to the victim. Still, Owen's alibi held. His crewmates confirmed he had been on the boat the entire night, and their trip logs matched the weather and tide charts for the area. What unsettled Hart most wasn't what they had found, it was what they hadn't. Cases like this usually left traces, a dropped purse, a footprint, a witness who heard something. Here there was nothing, and the longer there was nothing, the less likely it seemed they would find her alive. By the end of October, the case had cooled enough for the state police to scale back their involvement. Greyhaven returned to its quiet routine, though a shadow lingered over its streets. Parents no longer let their children walk home after dark. Women kept their doors locked during the day. In a place where crime was supposed to be something that happened elsewhere, Marissa's disappearance was a wound that didn't heal. Then, in late November, something changed. A fisherman named David Norcross was checking his lobster traps near a stretch of rocky shoreline 2 miles north of town when he spotted something in the shallows. At first he thought it was driftwood, but as his boat drew closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a woman's shoe, tangled in seaweed. The leather darkened from weeks in the water. Inside the shoe was a foot. The discovery sent shockwaves through Greyhaven. The shoe was quickly identified as belonging to Marissa Bell, a distinctive burgundy ankle boot she had worn often, but the rest of her body was nowhere to be found. The medical examiner confirmed the foot had been severed post-mortem, though whether by human hands or the ocean's movement was unclear. For Hart it was both a breakthrough and a deepening mystery. The tides in that area could carry debris for miles, making it nearly impossible to know where the foot had entered the water, and without more remains, they had no clear cause of death. But it did confirm one thing: Marissa Bell had not simply walked away from her life. Something had happened to her, something violent, and somewhere out there, whether in the town she'd called home or in the dark stretches beyond, someone knew exactly what that something was. In the weeks following the grim discovery of Marissa Bell's shoe and foot, the mood in Greyhaven seemed to shift in a way that was hard to define but impossible to ignore. The town's streets, usually dotted with neighbors exchanging quick waves and friendly conversation, were quieter. People kept to themselves more. The creak of a screen door at night might send a neighbor glancing over their shoulder, and even though the official search had been scaled down, the case seemed to follow everyone around like a lingering shadow. Chief Hart found himself replaying the timeline in his head every night. He had done this long enough to know that when answers didn't come quickly, they often didn't come at all. But something about this case refused to let him go. He was haunted by the image of Marissa walking out of the bakery that evening, her coat pulled tight against the wind, her hands in her pockets, not knowing she was stepping into the last moments of her life. The clue from the fisherman, the shoe, had given Hart a starting point, but it was a maddeningly vague one. The rocky stretch where it had been found was wild, jagged, and largely inaccessible except by boat. Locals called that part of the coastline the Teeth, because from a distance, the rocks looked like the jagged grin of some great sea creature. Lobster traps occasionally washed up there, their ropes shredded by the sharp edges. Forensic divers combed the area for 2 days after the discovery, but found nothing else. The tides could have easily carried the shoe from miles away. Hart had sent the boot to the state lab. The report came back a week later. No blood, no trace DNA other than Marissa's. The laces were still tied, which suggested the shoe had come off with the foot still inside, not in the struggle, but after. Whether by deliberate dismemberment or the brutal efficiency of the ocean's currents remained uncertain. What gnawed at Hart more than the gruesome detail was the implication: if the foot had washed ashore after weeks in the water, it meant Marissa's body had likely been disposed of somewhere off the coast. The killer, if that's what they were dealing with,
had either access to a boat or knew someone who did. Hart returned to the people closest to Marissa, this time pushing harder. Lila, the friend who had been expecting her that night, seemed exhausted. She'd been questioned multiple times, and each time her story was the same. She had been home all evening, waiting for Marissa to stop by, and when she didn't, she assumed plans had changed. She admitted she'd been drinking wine and watching television, and she couldn't recall if she'd heard anything unusual outside. Owen Carver, Marissa's boyfriend, remained distraught but steady in his insistence that he had been at sea the entire night. Hart questioned him again in the cramped cabin of his fishing boat, the smell of salt and diesel thick in the air. Owen's eyes were red-rimmed, his hands rough and calloused from hauling lines. She was different that week, he said quietly. Like she was distracted, worried about something. I asked her, but she brushed it off. Just said she was tired. Hart pressed him. Had Marissa mentioned the man in the dark jacket, the one she'd told Lila about? Owen hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. She said some guy had been hanging around. I told her to tell your people, but she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Thought she might have just been imagining it. But, now I'm not so sure. It was the third time Hart had heard about the stranger, but still no one could identify him. Hart put in a request to neighboring towns to check for any arrests, incidents, or sightings of men matching the vague description: tall, thin, dark jacket, smoker. Nothing came back. It was around this time that small, seemingly insignificant details began to surface, things that hadn't seemed worth mentioning in the chaotic first days of the investigation. A woman named Harriet Lowell, who ran a bed and breakfast near the harbor, told Hart that about a week before Marissa vanished, a man had come in asking about rooms. He didn't stay, but Harriet remembered he had a certain unsettling manner, polite but with an intensity in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. She remembered because he smoked outside while speaking to her, the tip of his cigarette glowing in the dusk, and because he'd asked about quiet spots along the coast, where a person could sit undisturbed. Hart's stomach turned at that detail. Harriet's description fit the stranger perfectly, though she couldn't say for certain it was the same man Marissa had seen. Still, it was the first concrete lead that suggested the man hadn't just been loitering, he might have been scouting. Hart ordered a door-to-door canvass again, this time focusing on the stretch between the bakery and the harbor, and then further out toward the isolated edges of town. It was grueling work, and more than one resident expressed frustration at being questioned again. But this time, a new piece of information surfaced. An older man named Paul Letham, who lived alone in a weathered shack on the outskirts of town, said he'd been walking his dog the night Marissa vanished. Around 8:20 p.m., he saw a dark sedan parked just off the road, its headlights off. He thought it odd, since very few people parked there. It wasn't near any houses or trails. As he passed, he noticed a tall man leaning against the driver's side, smoking. Latham didn't see anyone else, and kept walking, thinking little of it at the time. When Hart showed him a lineup of possible vehicle types, Latham pointed to an older model Ford Crown Victoria. It wasn't much, but it was something, a possible vehicle tied to the man. Hart put out an alert to look for any Crown Victorias registered in the surrounding counties, particularly dark-colored ones. As this was unfolding, the state lab sent over another report, this one concerning the small amount of sand and plant matter found inside Marissa's shoe. The sand was unusual. It was darker, coarser than what was common on Greyhaven's beaches. Analysis showed it matched a very specific location, a narrow strip of shoreline beneath the cliffs 2 miles north, accessible only at low tide or by boat. Hart knew the spot. Few people went there. It was dangerous, slippery, and hemmed in by steep rock walls. That discovery added a chilling layer to the case. Whoever had left Marissa's remains there either knew the area well, or had taken the time to find a secluded place where they wouldn't be disturbed. It suggested planning, forethought, not an impulsive act. Hart and a small team hiked down to the cliffs at the next low tide. The wind was sharp, and waves smashed against the rocks below, sending spray into the air. The ground was slick, the footing treacherous. They searched for hours, finding nothing but driftwood, gull feathers, and the skeletal remains of fish. If Marissa's body had been left here, the sea had long since taken the rest. Meanwhile, The community was fracturing under the weight of fear and suspicion. Whispers about who could have done it grew sharper, more pointed. Old grudges resurfaced in the form of ugly accusations. Hart received anonymous tips naming everyone from reclusive loners to respected business owners. Most were baseless, but each one had to be checked. Then came an unexpected call from the state police in a neighboring county. A patrol officer there had stopped a man for a broken taillight. The man had been driving an older model dark blue Crown Victoria. He had no criminal record, but his license showed he was not from the area. He claimed to be passing through on his way to visit a cousin in Massachusetts. The officer, aware of the Marissa Bell case, noted the man's resemblance to the vague description circulating, and wrote it up. His name was Walter Haynes, 39 years old, no fixed address, working odd jobs. When Hart read the report, a slow, unsettled feeling crept over him. He requested Haynes come in for questioning. Haynes agreed, arriving at the small station in a neatly pressed shirt, his manner calm, almost overly cooperative. He admitted he'd been in Greyhaven once or twice, but denied knowing Marissa. He said he had a habit of exploring small towns, enjoying the quiet and character. Hart studied him during the interview. Haynes was tall, lean, with pale eyes that didn't quite match the polite smile on his face. He smoked throughout the conversation, asking once if it was okay to light up indoors. Hart allowed it, watching the way Haynes tapped the ash slowly into the tray. They had nothing concrete to hold him on. No evidence tied him to Marissa, no witness who could place them together. Still, Hart walked away from that meeting with the distinct gnawing certainty that he had just spoken to someone who knew exactly what had happened on that October night. And in a town as small as Greyhaven, where secrets had nowhere to hide, it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The autumn air in Crestwood had shifted noticeably by mid-October, carrying with it the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The daylight shortened, and the streets that had once been bright and familiar took on an unfamiliar heaviness. Marissa Bell had been missing for over 5 weeks, and the town's collective anxiety had settled into a strange rhythm, one of quiet dread, whispered speculation, and growing impatience with the absence of answers. Detective Laura Hanlon had spent those 5 weeks chasing every lead that emerged, no matter how fragile it seemed. In that time, her desk had become a scattered map of the investigation, photographs, handwritten witness statements, street diagrams, and the growing stack of cell phone records she had read over and over. Each day she returned to the same question: was Marissa still alive, or was the search now for her body? Some people in town, while unwilling to say it outright, had already resigned themselves to the darker possibility. But Hanlon wasn't ready to let go of hope. There was something about Marissa's last known movements that gnawed at her. The details didn't quite add up, not in the way most missing person cases did. On September 5th, the night she vanished, Marissa had left a small gathering at her friend Danielle's apartment around 10:45 p.m. It was just a few blocks from her own home, a short walk along residential streets lined with dim streetlights. Danielle remembered her being in good spirits, though distracted by something she wouldn't talk about. Marissa had checked her phone several times, almost as if she were waiting for a message. She left without asking anyone to walk with her, something Danielle later said felt a little unusual, though not unusual enough to raise alarms at the time. The camera at a gas station on 8th Street captured a grainy shot of Marissa passing by at 10:56 p.m. Her pace seemed steady, her hands in her jacket pockets. A minute later, she walked out of frame. That was the last confirmed sighting. When Hanlon revisited Danielle's apartment to retrace the steps, she noticed something subtle but important from that gas station. Marissa should have been home in less than 3 minutes. Yet no camera, not the one across from her street, not the one at the corner store, ever caught her image again. In cases like this, it was often the space between sightings that held the truth. Somewhere between the gas station and her front door, something had happened. The distance wasn't much, but in that gap lay the answer to what became of her. On the morning of October 12th, Hanlon stood again on 8th Street, this time in the early dawn before the sun had fully risen. She walked the same route Marissa would have taken, noting the sight lines, the pools of darkness where the street lamps were out, the alleyways that intersected the block. It wasn't hard to imagine how someone could step out of the shadows without being seen. Even a car slowing alongside her could have gone unnoticed in that quiet stretch. Back at the station, Hanlon's attention was drawn to one particular detail from a witness statement. A man who lived on the corner of 8th and Willow had reported hearing a short, sharp yell around 11 p.m. on the night Marissa vanished. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, and by the time he looked out his window, the street was empty. His account had been logged weeks earlier, but the significance of the timing, right in that gap between the gas station sighting and her expected arrival home, felt more pressing now. A deeper look into Marissa's phone records revealed a final outgoing text at 10:47 p.m., sent to an unknown number not stored in her contacts. The message was brief, just 3 words: "I'm almost there." What struck Hanlon was that it didn't match any destination in the night's known plans. She wasn't almost to Danielle's, nor almost home, unless she had intended to meet someone along the way. That number was traced to a prepaid phone, purchased 2 weeks before her disappearance from a store in a neighboring county. No name, no address, no way to link it easily to a person. Whoever owned it had turned it off minutes after receiving that text. It had never been turned on again. The town's unease deepened when rumors began to circulate. People whispered about sightings that hadn't been reported. A dark sedan idling on Willow Street late that night. A tall man in a hooded jacket walking in the opposite direction of Marissa's route. None of these could be confirmed, but the repetition of the same details in different accounts made Hanlon pause. Sometimes rumors grew out of nothing, but other times, they were the fragmented truth making its way through frightened mouths. By late October, the volunteer search groups had dwindled. At first, dozens of locals had combed fields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. But with each passing week, the effort grew quieter, more resigned. Now it was mostly the family, and a handful of close friends, who continued the physical search, while police worked the investigation from other angles. For Marissa's parents, Paul and Irene Bell, the waiting was unbearable. Their home had become a place of constant movement, family bringing food, friends dropping by to check on them, detectives stopping in with updates that were never quite updates at all. Her bedroom remained exactly as it had been, down to the folded blanket at the foot of the bed. Irene sometimes sat there in the evenings, holding one of Marissa's sweaters, hoping for the impossible, that she would hear her daughter's voice coming through the front door again. On Halloween night, Hanlon stayed at the station well past midnight, reading over every piece of evidence yet again. That was when she noticed something buried in the supplemental report from the first week. A patrol officer had logged seeing a white van parked on Willow Street around 11:10 p.m., facing the opposite direction from Marissa's home. At the time, there had been no reason to connect it to the case, and the van had been gone by the next morning. But paired with the timeline, the van's location matched exactly where she would have been walking. Hanlon requested traffic camera footage from 2 nearby intersections, hoping for a glimpse of that vehicle. The process was slow. Archived footage from that period wasn't well organized, and it required manual review. Still, she believed the answer might lie there. Days later, a frame emerged, a blurry white van turning onto 8th Street at 10:58 p.m., just 2 minutes after Marissa passed the gas station camera. Its taillights glowed faintly in the drizzle. The next frame, captured from a different angle, showed the van parked at the curb, the driver's side door open. The rest of the image was swallowed in shadow. Though it wasn't definitive proof, the alignment with Marissa's route was chilling. There were still no plates visible, no way to identify the driver, but Hanlon's instincts told her this was not coincidence. The development reignited whispers in town. People began to connect this sighting with an unsettling fact. 6 months before Marissa vanished, another young woman from a nearby town had reported a man in a white van following her late at night. She had managed to get away, but the case had never been solved. Police records confirmed it, but no link had been established. Until now, perhaps. By early November, Hanlon had narrowed her focus. She compiled a list of every registered white van in the surrounding counties, cross-referencing them with known offenders, and anyone with a history of stalking or harassment. It was a slow, painstaking process, but the possibility of overlap with other cases kept her pushing forward. The problem was that the trail was already cold. Whoever had taken Marissa had been deliberate, careful enough to leave no trace in the immediate aftermath, careful enough to keep their distance from the investigation, but as Hanlon knew too well, careful people still made mistakes, and the smallest one could unravel the entire facade. The Bell family clung to that hope as the second month of Marissa's absence came to an end. The leaves had mostly fallen by now, leaving bare branches stretching against a grey sky. The days were colder, the nights longer, and the empty place at the Bell family's table more difficult to ignore. For Detective Hanlon, the case had shifted from a missing person search to something darker. She didn't say it aloud, but she felt it in her gut. Somewhere out there, someone knew exactly what had happened on that September night, and if they had done it before, they could do it again. By the first week of December, Crestwood had taken on its winter quiet, that particular hush that comes when the first frost lingers into morning, and the streets seem slower, as though even the air is conserving its energy. Snow threatened on the horizon, but so far only cold rain fell, slicking the sidewalks, and darkening the bare tree branches. Marissa Bell had been missing for 3 months. Her parents now spoke less about her coming home, and more about needing to know the truth. It was an unspoken shift, one Hanlon recognized from other families she'd worked with. At some point, the fragile hope gave way to a different kind of endurance, the resolve to face whatever reality waited, even if it was the one they feared most. Detective Laura Hanlon had spent the past several weeks working almost entirely on tracing the white van. The problem was that vans, especially older models, were common enough that without a visible plate or distinctive markings, narrowing down a single suspect felt like finding a shadow in a darkened room. She had a spreadsheet with over 70 names connected to vans registered within a 30-mile radius. Most were quickly ruled out. Work vehicles, delivery trucks, or accounted for by solid alibis on the night of September 5th, but 4 names remained. 4 owners, who had no clear work records for that night, whose alibis were either thin or unverifiable. One of them, a man named Richard Clem, lived in the neighboring county, and had a minor record, trespassing, disorderly conduct, but nothing that connected him directly to violent crimes. Still, his address placed him less than 15 minutes from the spot where Marissa vanished, and his van was the same make and year as the one in the grainy footage. Hanlon requested surveillance on Clem, not yet enough for a warrant, but enough to watch for patterns. The officers assigned noted that he kept irregular hours, often leaving his small rental house late at night, driving without clear destinations, circling certain neighborhoods before heading home. It was behavior that could have innocent explanations, insomnia, aimless drives, but it was enough to keep him on the list. While this was unfolding, an unexpected break came from an entirely different direction. A retired mail carrier, named June Reynolds, walked into the station one morning, and asked to speak to Hanlon. She carried a small notebook in her hand, worn from use. She explained that she had been keeping her own notes about the case, just in case something didn't sit right. June lived 2 blocks from where Marissa was last seen. On the night of September 5th, she had been out later than usual, returning from a family dinner. As she pulled into her driveway around 11:05 p.m., she noticed a white van idling near the corner of Willow Street. The street lamp above it flickered in and out, casting the vehicle alternately in light and shadow. What caught her attention wasn't the van itself, but the fact that the driver's side door was open, and a figure stood near the back, looking down at something on the ground. She couldn't see what it was, only that the figure moved quickly back into the driver's seat when a car passed in the opposite direction. At the time, she thought little of it. Only later, after hearing about Marissa's disappearance, did she connect the moment. Hanlon listened carefully, her mind drawing lines between June's account and the footage she'd already seen. It was the first witness description that placed the van exactly where Marissa would have been, and more importantly, it suggested that someone outside the vehicle had been engaged in something on the street itself. Armed with this, Hanlon revisited the 4 remaining van owners. She brought each in for informal questioning, using the description and timing as points of pressure. 3 of them seemed genuinely puzzled by the line of questioning, offering up work logs, receipts, and even dashcam footage, that placed them elsewhere. Clem, however, reacted differently. He was calm at first, almost casual, but when asked directly if he'd been near Willow Street that night, his answers began to stumble. He claimed he'd been out driving, but couldn't recall where. Asked why his van had been seen idling with the driver's door open, he said maybe he'd been checking something in the back. It was vague, and his eyes avoided hers as he spoke. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. Hanlon knew she needed something tangible. Fibers, fingerprints, DNA, anything to tie him directly to Marissa. Without it, the case would stall. That break came 2 weeks later, when a groundskeeper at a county park 10 miles south of Crestwood reported finding a woman's jacket partially buried in leaves along a trail. It was navy blue, weather-worn, with a torn lining. A tag inside bore the name Imbel, written in black marker.
Hanlon drove to the site herself, walking the path in the cold morning air. The jacket lay just off the trail, as though it had been tossed or dropped in haste. The surrounding area was dense with trees, the ground uneven with roots and rocks. It was a place you could easily miss something if you weren't looking. The jacket was sent for forensic analysis. Dirt, plant matter, and a small hair, light brown, were found clinging to the fabric. DNA tests began, and the wait was agonizing. When the results came in, they confirmed the hair belonged to Marissa, but more importantly, a second DNA profile was recovered from the collar, a partial match to Richard Clem, drawn from an old misdemeanor record. It was enough for a warrant. On a cold December morning, officers descended on Clem's property. The search turned up more than Hanlon had anticipated. In the back of the white van, beneath a false floor, they found a small collection of women's belongings, scarves, bracelets, and 2 cell phones, neither belonging to Marissa. One of them matched the description of a phone taken from the earlier stalking case in the neighboring town. In a locked box in Clem's garage, police discovered a driver's license belonging to Marissa, along with her missing wallet. The air in the garage felt heavier as each item was pulled into the light. Confronted with the evidence, Clem refused to speak. He neither confirmed nor denied knowing Marissa, staring at the table in the interrogation room as if the questions were coming from another world. His attorney advised him to remain silent, and so he did. But the physical evidence was damning. In January, Clem was formally charged with the abduction and murder of Marissa Bell. The search for her body continued, but as winter deepened, snow covered the fields and woods, hiding whatever remained. For the Bell family, the arrest was both a relief and another kind of heartbreak. They had wanted answers, and now they had them, but not the answer that brought Marissa home. The trial would be long, and the absence would stretch through it all. Hanlon kept a photograph of Marissa on her desk, the same one Irene had given her early in the case. In it, Marissa was laughing at something out of frame, her hair caught in a breeze. It was the image Hanlon chose to remember, rather than the cold evidence boxes stacked in the evidence room. In February, a thaw revealed patches of earth along the river south of town. A group of hikers found skeletal remains tangled in undergrowth. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Marissa. The recovery site was only a few miles from where the jacket had been found, suggesting Clem had disposed of her in stages, or perhaps returned later for reasons known only to him. The prosecution would argue that the location, combined with the timeline and forensic evidence, painted an undeniable picture. When Clem's trial began in the fall, the courtroom was full. Residents who had followed the case sat alongside reporters, and the Bell family occupied the front row. Hanlon testified about the investigation, the van footage, the witness accounts, and the discovery of Marissa's belongings. Each detail was laid out methodically, the same way she had worked the case. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than a day. Clem was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. Afterward, Irene Bell spoke quietly to a small circle of reporters outside the courthouse. She thanked the community for their support, the police for their persistence, and said she hoped no other family would have to endure what theirs had. Her voice broke only once when she said, "At least now she can rest." For Hanlon, the conclusion of the trial was not an ending, but the closing of a chapter. The photograph of Marissa remained on her desk. Cases like these never truly left. They became part of the weight a detective carried forward. In Crestwood, life gradually resumed its ordinary patterns, though certain corners of the town still held the memory of that September night. The gas station on 8th Street, the flickering street lamp on Willow, the quiet stretch of road where shadows once hid the truth. They remained silent witnesses to the moment Marissa Bell disappeared from view. The disappearance of Margaret Ellison began on a warm spring afternoon in 1993, in the small river town of Harrow's Bend, Missouri, the kind of place where most folks knew not only their neighbors but the rhythm of their lives. Margaret was 42, a mother of 2 grown sons, and worked as a librarian at the town's single-story public library, a building whose white-painted trim and wide front porch made it look more like a farmhouse than a civic space. She had a reputation for being steady, thoughtful, and deeply private. People often said she seemed like someone who knew more than she let on, though never in a secretive way, more in the sense that she quietly carried the stories of everyone she'd met. On April 17th, she left the library just after 4 p.m., locking the front doors behind her. It was a Friday, and she had plans to visit her sister's house on the other side of town for dinner. The walk should have taken 20 minutes at most. Margaret never arrived. The first hours after she failed to appear passed without alarm. Her sister assumed she'd gotten caught up talking to someone or decided to go home first. But by 8 p.m., with no phone call and no sign of her, worry began to set in. Margaret's small clapboard house sat near the end of Willow Lane, on the edge of Harrow's Bend's historic district. The lights inside were off when her sister arrived to check, and her car, an aging blue Oldsmobile, was still parked out front. A glance through the living room window showed everything in place, as though Margaret had never returned from work. By midnight, the local police had been notified. In 1993, Harrow's Bend was not a town with a lot of missing persons cases, and the officers on duty treated it with urgency. They began retracing her likely route, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen her between the library and her sister's home. The route was simple: down Main Street, across the old iron bridge over the river, then a turn onto Maple Avenue. Most of that walk passed through visible open streets, yet not a single person recalled seeing Margaret that evening. One detail did emerge, however. Around 4:20 p.m., a teenager named Caleb Porter, who lived above his family's hardware store on Main Street, told officers he'd seen a dark green pickup truck parked near the corner of Main and Pine. The truck's driver, a man Caleb described as in his 40s maybe, with a big tan hat, was standing outside the vehicle looking toward the sidewalk. Caleb didn't see Margaret, but the image of the man stuck with him because he seemed to be waiting for something. At the time, the sighting didn't feel like much more than a vague lead. Pickup trucks were common in Harrow's Bend, and the description of the man was too general to point to anyone in particular. Detective Alan Mercer took the lead on the case. Mercer was in his early 50s, with a patient demeanor that suited slow, methodical investigations. He began with the basics, interviewing Margaret's family, friends, and co-workers. There were no signs of personal turmoil, no debts, no recent arguments, no sudden changes in behavior. Margaret's sister described her as content, if a little lonely sometimes. She'd been divorced for over a decade and had dated only casually since. By Monday, the search had expanded. Volunteers combed the riverbanks and wooded lots near town. The Harrow's Bend police requested assistance from the county sheriff's department, who brought in search dogs. The dogs followed Margaret's scent for nearly half a mile from the library, right up to the middle of the old iron bridge before losing it entirely. That detail chilled Mercer more than he let on. Losing the scent in the middle of a bridge suggested one of two things: either Margaret had gotten into a vehicle there, or she had gone into the river. The river was searched, but no trace was found. As the first week passed, the case began to draw attention from outside Harrow's Bend. Local news crews set up near the library, and reporters asked residents for their impressions of Margaret. Most described her as quiet but warm, someone who had a gift for remembering details about people's lives. Several mentioned that she sometimes walked home along the riverside path instead of the main streets, especially in warmer weather. That prompted a closer search of the path, a narrow trail running parallel to the river, partially hidden by overhanging trees. It was here on the 7th day of the search that an officer found something unusual, a small leather-bound notebook lying just off the trail, damp from recent rain. The notebook was Margaret's. Her sister confirmed it instantly. It was the same one she carried in her purse for jotting down notes, grocery lists, and fragments of poems she liked. The last page contained a single line, written in her neat script, "Meet me where the bridge bends." The phrase puzzled everyone. Margaret wasn't known for cryptic messages, and no one could say what "where the bridge bends" meant. The old iron bridge was perfectly straight. Mercer considered the possibility that it referred to a place near the bridge, perhaps a figurative bend in the landscape. He also considered that it might have been a meeting she'd agreed to, voluntarily or under some form of pressure. The notebook shifted the investigation's tone. If Margaret had been lured somewhere, the abduction could have been premeditated. That meant whoever had taken her might have known her routines, even anticipated her route. One name began to surface quietly in town gossip, a man named Howard Vale. He was in his late 40s, lived alone on a small property outside town, and was known to spend a lot of time near the river, fishing or walking. Some residents mentioned that he'd been in the library more often in the weeks before Margaret disappeared, sometimes lingering until closing. He drove a dark green pickup. Mercer visited Vale's property on April 27th. Vale was polite but guarded, claiming he barely knew Margaret and had last seen her maybe a month back. When asked where he was on April 17th, he said he'd been home all afternoon, working on his truck. No one could confirm the alibi. The green pickup was parked in his driveway. Mercer noted that its bed was recently washed, unusually clean for a vehicle that otherwise looked weathered. Lacking direct evidence, Mercer couldn't press further. But Vale's name stayed in his notes, underlined twice. By May the leads had slowed. The case remained active, but without sightings, new evidence, or a confession. Margaret's disappearance threatened to join the long list of small-town mysteries that fade into whispered recollection. Then on May 19th, a fisherman spotted something lodged against a cluster of reeds in a shallow bend of the river, about 5 miles downstream. It was a pale blue scarf, tangled and frayed. Margaret's sister identified it as hers, the same scarf she'd worn to work on the day she vanished. The scarf's location was downstream from the bridge, suggesting it could have entered the water there, but Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that someone had put it there deliberately, perhaps to mislead the investigation. That night, sitting in his dimly lit office, Mercer took out the notebook again. The line repeated in his head, "Meet me where the bridge bends." He thought about the bridge, the river, and the way the current curved sharply just beyond the south bank. It was there, in that sudden bend of water, that someone could wait unseen from the road above. Detective Alan Mercer stood at the south end of the old iron bridge early the next morning, staring down at the bend in the river. The spring rains had been frequent, and the water below churned brown and restless. From this angle, he could see how the river curved hard to the east after flowing under the bridge, carving away at the bank over the years. The current there was deceptively fast, a narrow bottleneck of power before it widened again and slowed. If Margaret had met someone here, it was a clever choice for them, isolated enough that few would notice, but still within walking distance of town. The only people who would likely pass by would be joggers or fishermen, and even they would be rare on a Friday evening in April. Mercer imagined her walking toward this spot, scarf around her neck, notebook tucked in her bag. He pictured the sound of her shoes on the old planks, the hum of the wind through the bridge's rusting trusses, and the river's constant whispering below. The phrase in her notebook, "Meet me where the bridge bends," kept returning to him. It wasn't an exact location. It was poetic vague. He wondered if that was deliberate, or if the person she was meeting would have instantly known what it meant. Either way, it felt private, like an inside reference. Mercer called in the county crime scene team, asking them to comb both ends of the bridge and the riverbank below. They searched for hours, scanning the mud for shoe prints, the railings for fingerprints. They found a few cigarette butts,
and an old beer can, but nothing they could directly tie to Margaret. The April rain had likely washed away most physical evidence days ago. Back in town, Mercer revisited the list of people who had interacted with Margaret in the weeks before her disappearance. The name that still stood out was Howard Vale. He drove the right kind of truck. He spent time near the river. He had been in the library often enough for staff to notice, and there was something about his overly calm demeanor during the first interview that bothered Mercer. Not nervous exactly, but rehearsed, like a man performing what he thought innocence should look like. Mercer decided to make a second trip to Vale's property. This time he brought Deputy Carla Hines with him, a younger officer with a sharp eye for detail. When they arrived, Vale was in his yard, stacking firewood. He greeted them with a nod, wiping his hands on a rag. "We've still got some follow-up questions," Mercer said. "About the librarian?" Vale asked, as though the name Margaret were too familiar to speak. "Yes, you said you hadn't seen her in a month, but a witness recalls seeing a green pickup near Main and Pine on the day she vanished. That was around the time she left work." Vale leaned on his axe handle. "There are half a dozen green trucks in this town." "True," Mercer said, "but not all of them belong to men who've been visiting the library every few days." For the first time Vale's expression flickered, a momentary tightening around his eyes. "I like to read," he said. "That's not a crime." Hines stepped in. "What about the bed of your truck? Looked spotless last time we were here. You detail it often." Vale's gaze shifted toward his driveway. "I wash it when I need to. Gets muddy out here." Mercer let the silence draw out, hoping it would make Vale fill it. But the man only shrugged, then turned back toward his woodpile. Without a warrant, Mercer couldn't press further. Still, as they drove away, Hines said quietly, "He's hiding something." That night, Mercer reviewed the call logs from the library's public phone, an older detail, but one that could matter if Margaret had arranged a meeting. Most calls were to local numbers, friends or family, but on April 15th, 2 days before she vanished, there had been a short outgoing call to a payphone outside a gas station 20 miles away. The station clerk remembered seeing a man in a tan hat, using it later that day. Mercer felt a small pulse of adrenaline. A tan hat matched the vague description given by Caleb Porter, the teenager who'd seen the pickup on Main Street. But the lead was tenuous. No recording of the call, no proof of who had answered it. Still, it was something. While Mercer worked the angle quietly, Margaret's family was struggling under the weight of uncertainty. Her sister Linda came to the station often, sometimes to ask about progress, sometimes just to sit. She brought Mercer a box from Margaret's house one afternoon, saying, "I thought you might find something in here." It contained personal notebooks, letters and a small tin of photographs. Most of the notebooks were filled with book recommendations, favorite poems, and mundane reminders. But in one dated the year before her disappearance, Margaret had written a series of reflections about walking along the river. One entry caught Mercer's attention. "The bend past the bridge feels like the edge of the world. I stand there and think about how easy it would be to vanish, to let the water take everything away." It wasn't a confession of intent, but it was eerie. It showed that where the bridge bends had been on her mind long before the note in her purse. 2 weeks later, there was a break, though not the kind Mercer had hoped for. A local fisherman found a shoe half buried in silt on the riverbank about 6 miles downstream. It was a plain leather flat, size 7, Margaret's size, and her sister confirmed it was hers. But the shoe was scuffed and waterlogged, and there was no way to know if it had been in the river since April 17th, or placed there later. Forensic testing turned up nothing. No fingerprints, no blood, just river water and mud. The case had now drawn the attention of the state investigators, who visited Harrow's Bend in mid-May. They spoke with Mercer, reviewed the evidence, and ultimately offered only procedural suggestions, none of which brought him closer to answers. The weeks were slipping by, and with each day, public hope dimmed. Still, Mercer couldn't shake the image of Margaret's last walk. He began quietly checking the routines of other people who used the riverside path: runners, dog walkers, fishermen. One man, an older resident, named Earl Maddox, mentioned seeing a green pickup parked near the bend more than once in the month before Margaret vanished. Sometimes there was a guy standing by the rail, Earl said. Sometimes he was just sitting inside, staring at the water. Earl didn't know the man's name, but his description matched Vale again. Mercer felt the net tightening, but without direct evidence, he couldn't move in. He began requesting background checks, hoping for something, an old assault charge, a history of harassment, that could justify closer surveillance. What he found was a record of a trespassing arrest from 1985, dismissed for lack of evidence. Vale had been accused of entering a woman's property late at night, but claimed he was looking for a lost dog. No one could prove otherwise. Mercer decided to watch him himself. For 3 evenings in a row, he parked an unmarked car near the bend in the river. On the second night, just after dusk, a green pickup rolled slowly onto the gravel shoulder. Vale got out, wearing the same tan hat described by Caleb Porter, and leaned on the railing, looking down at the water. He stayed there for nearly 20 minutes before driving away. Mercer didn't confront him, not yet. He wanted to see if Vale would return, and on the 4th night, he did. This time, Mercer saw him walking down the embankment toward the riverbank, disappearing briefly into the trees. When Vale returned, he was carrying something small wrapped in cloth, which he placed in the truck bed before leaving. Mercer followed him discreetly, until Vale pulled into a diner parking lot. Vale went inside, leaving the truck unattended. Mercer took the risk, lifting the cloth just enough to see a small tin box inside. It was the same kind of box Margaret used for photographs. Before Mercer could examine it further, Vale reappeared, forcing him to retreat. That box, Mercer knew, could be the key, but without a warrant, he had to wait. The next morning, he went to a judge, outlining the circumstantial web, the green truck, the sightings at the bend, the wash truck bed, the matching tan hat, and now the tin box. The judge agreed, barely to issue a search warrant for Vale's property and vehicle. Mercer and a team executed the warrant at dawn. The following day, the tin box was in the truck bed, wrapped just as Mercer had seen. Inside were 6 photographs, each showing the same location, the bend in the river as seen from the bank. 2 of the photographs had dates written on the back, April 10th and April 17th. The latter was the day Margaret vanished. There were no pictures of her, no overtly incriminating shots, but the fact that Vale had been documenting that spot, on those dates, was damning in Mercer's eyes. They also found a folded piece of paper in Vale's glove compartment. It contained a short note, written in a neat feminine hand: Friday, Bridge Bends, 4:15. The handwriting looked eerily like Margaret's. The discovery of the note in Howard Vale's glove compartment intensified the investigation in a way that felt both promising and ominous. Detective Mercer sat in his office late one evening, turning the fragile piece of paper over between his fingers. The neat handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's, matching the samples taken from her journals and letters. How did Vale come to possess such a personal message? Was it a clue that Margaret had planned the meeting, or was it something darker, a trap? Mercer understood that the note could not stand alone as evidence. It was too ambiguous, too easily explained away by a man who claimed innocent intentions. But combined with the other fragments, the green pickup sightings, the trips to the river bend, the photographs, it created a thread that could unravel a deeper story. The days that followed were a whirlwind of interrogations and searches. Vale's story remained consistent. He insisted he had no idea what happened to Margaret, and denied ever meeting her at the river. He said the note must have been planted or stolen, and claimed he had found the photographs discarded near the library, taking them in as an act of curiosity. His calmness had not faded, but beneath it, Mercer sensed something like a slow-burning anger, as if Vale believed himself above suspicion. Mercer brought in handwriting experts to confirm the note's authenticity. Their analysis was definitive. The note was indeed penned by Margaret Ellison. That fact alone was enough to renew public interest, and soon the story dominated local news outlets. Yet the more public the case became, the more elusive answers grew. No one had seen Vale and Margaret together. No witnesses placed them in the same space at the same time. There was no CCTV at the river bend, no modern tracking technology to fill in the gaps of her last movements. Meanwhile, Margaret's family was caught in a torturous limbo. Her mother, Jean, struggled with sleepless nights and a sense of guilt that hung heavy in the air. "I keep thinking I should have noticed something," she told Mercer during one meeting, something in her voice, a change in her smile, but she was so quiet, so private. Linda, Margaret's sister, took to organizing community searches along the riverbanks and nearby woods, enlisting volunteers to scour places the police had yet to examine. They found old cigarette butts, broken branches, but nothing that could be directly linked to Margaret. Each discovery raised hopes only to dissolve into frustration. Mercer, sensing the mounting pressure, decided to revisit the forensic evidence from the shoe found downstream. He reached out to specialists, who used advanced techniques to analyze trace materials embedded in the fabric. Their findings were subtle but significant. The shoe contained traces of two types of pollen, one common to the riverside plants near the bridge, and another from a rare flower cultivated in a private garden on the outskirts of Harrow's Bend. The discovery hinted at movement beyond the public river paths. Someone had brought the shoe, or Margaret herself had ventured into a less accessible area. Mercer turned his attention back to Vale's property, particularly his garden. He secured another warrant, this time to conduct a thorough search of the grounds. Vale's reaction was telling. He was present during the search, watching silently as officers dug up patches of earth and examined rows of unusual plants. They uncovered a small bed of rare lilies, exactly the kind found in the pollen samples. The flowers were healthy, vibrant, and growing in neat rows. "It's a hobby," Vale said flatly when asked about the garden. "Nothing more." But Mercer's instincts whispered otherwise. Whoever had taken Margaret's shoe, if it was Vale, had at least tried to mask the evidence in a place he felt secure. That same week, Mercer received a call from the local post office. A package had arrived, addressed to Margaret, but returned to sender with no forwarding address. Inside was an old book of poetry, its pages dog-eared and stained, with a bookmark on a page featuring a poem about disappearance and solitude. The sender was anonymous. It was yet another puzzle piece, adding layers to a case already dense with unanswered questions. Who wanted Margaret to receive that book? Was it a message? A taunt? Mercer shared the development with Linda, who grew pale reading the poem aloud. "It's like they're toying with us," she whispered, knowing how she felt, knowing what she wanted to say. Late one evening, Mercer went over the timelines once more, compiling witness statements, traffic patterns and phone records. He realized that several key gaps existed. Windows when Margaret's phone had pinged off a tower miles from town, at odd hours inconsistent with her known routines. No one had explained these anomalies. Curious and cautious, Mercer and Hines worked to identify the owners of phones active near those towers. One number stood out, registered under a burner phone, bought from a convenience store only days before Margaret's disappearance. The store clerk described the buyer as a man in his late 40s, wearing a tan hat. Mercer's throat tightened. The description matched Vale again. With growing conviction, Mercer requested authorization for a wiretap and electronic surveillance of Vale's phone. Over the next 10 days, they gathered snippets of conversations, coded references, and one overheard phrase that made Mercer's heart stop. At the Bend, Friday. The police moved quickly. On a chilly Friday evening, officers surrounded Vale's property. Mercer watched from the shadows as they made their way inside. Vale did not resist. In his workshop, the police found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside lay a collection of personal effects belonging to Margaret, a silver locket she always wore, her favorite pen, and several torn pages from her notebooks. There was also a small, crudely carved wooden box. Inside the box was a folded photograph. Margaret standing near the bridge bend, her expression serene but distant, as if caught between worlds. The photograph was dated April 16th, the day before her disappearance. Mercer felt a hollow ache. Somehow, Vale had possessed these intimate pieces of Margaret's life for weeks, holding them close yet refusing to reveal their meaning. Confronted with the evidence, Vale maintained a chilling calm. "I never harmed her," he said, voice steady but cold. "She trusted me. She needed someone to listen." Mercer pressed harder. "Where is she? What happened to Margaret Ellison?" Vale's eyes darkened. "You want a story. I'll give you one. But it's not what you think." Over the next hours, Vale spoke in fragments, a story of obsession, loneliness, and the desperate need for connection. He claimed Margaret had come to him willingly, seeking refuge from unseen dangers, that their meetings were consensual, private moments stolen from a world that misunderstood her. But the story unraveled under scrutiny. He refused to explain the torn notebook pages, or the notes found in his truck. He wouldn't reveal where Margaret was, or if she was alive. The silence was suffocating. The investigation expanded as the search grew urgent. Mercer coordinated river dives, drone scans, and volunteer patrols in the surrounding forests. Yet no trace of Margaret emerged. The case became a haunting riddle. In the weeks that followed, psychological profiles were created for both Vale and Margaret, trying to understand their motivations, fears, and vulnerabilities. Mercer pored over the reports, realizing the complexity of human behavior, the way loneliness could twist into obsession, and trust could be weaponized. He thought often of Margaret, a young woman with a gentle smile and quiet dreams, lost in the shadow of a community that barely knew her. And he thought of the river, relentless in its flow, carrying secrets beneath its surface. The search for truth continued, tangled in fragments of memory and silent questions, with the bend in the river remaining a place where the past lingered, and answers seemed just beyond reach. The days stretched into weeks, then months. The passage of time did little to soothe the ache of Margaret Ellison's disappearance. For Detective Mercer, each day was a reminder of a case that refused to yield its secrets. For Margaret's family and friends, it was a slow unraveling of hope, replaced by an unrelenting shadow of uncertainty. The investigation had grown into something larger than Mercer had initially anticipated. It was no longer simply about a missing young woman. It had become a study of human frailty and darkness, the subtle interplay between trust and betrayal, love and control. The fragments of Margaret's life, her journals, her letters, the photographs, and the haunting note found in Vale's truck, remained stubbornly enigmatic. Mercer returned often to the river bend, the place where so much had begun, and where perhaps the truth still lingered beneath the surface. The water flowed cold and clear, indifferent to the turmoil that had swept through the community. Trees leaned over the edge, their branches whispering with the wind, as if trying to speak in a language lost to time. In the quiet moments, Mercer imagined Margaret there alone but resilient, her eyes searching for something just out of reach. He thought of the contradictions in her story, a young woman who had longed for connection yet kept parts of herself fiercely hidden, someone whose vulnerability made her both tender and dangerously exposed. The forensic work on the shoe and the pollen samples had opened new avenues, but they were slow and painstaking. Scientists analyzed soil from Vale's garden, comparing it with samples from the riverbank. A faint match suggested the possibility that Margaret had indeed been taken to or near Vale's property, but no direct evidence placed her alive or dead there. Vale's refusal to speak plainly was both frustrating and maddening. He seemed to toy with the investigation, dropping hints and then retreating into silence. When pressed about the whereabouts of Margaret, he gave cryptic answers, sometimes poetic, sometimes coldly factual, but always frustratingly incomplete. "You don't understand," he said. During one interrogation, she needed to escape, to find a new world. I was helping her do that. Mercer wanted to believe there was some shred of truth in those words, but the absence of concrete facts left only suspicion. He studied Vale's past, his relationships, his patterns of behavior. There were inconsistencies, moments where Vale's calm veneer cracked, revealing a man struggling with his own demons. The community remained gripped by fear and sadness. News reports dwindled, but for those who knew Margaret, the pain was raw and persistent. Vigils were held, candles lit along the riverbank, voices raised in quiet prayer. Margaret's mother, Jean, found solace in these gatherings, clinging to the fragile hope that one day her daughter might be found. Linda, Margaret's sister, took to writing. She filled notebooks with memories, questions and messages to Margaret that she never sent. Her words were a lifeline, a way to keep her sister's spirit alive amid the growing darkness. One afternoon, a breakthrough came unexpectedly. A local fisherman contacted the police, reporting the discovery of a small weathered box tangled in roots near a remote section of the river. The box was old, carved with intricate designs, and inside were items unmistakably connected to Margaret: a silver bracelet she always wore, a fragment of fabric matching a jacket she had owned, and a small notebook page covered in her handwriting. The page was a fragment of a poem, unfinished, fragmented, haunting. Where shadows meet the river's sigh, I walk alone beneath the sky. In whispered dreams and silent fears, I leave behind the fading years.
Mercer examined the items carefully. The condition of the bracelet suggested it had been in the water for some time, yet the notebook page was remarkably preserved. The find reignited the investigation, raising painful questions. Had Margaret left these items as a message? Were they tokens of a final farewell, or clues to a deeper truth? The police intensified their search in the area around the discovery. They brought in divers, canine units, and forensic experts. Every inch of the riverbank was scoured. Yet, despite the renewed efforts, no further trace of Margaret emerged. The case began to attract attention from outside experts, psychologists, forensic specialists, and cold case investigators. Their analyses painted a complex portrait of Margaret and Vale's relationship. Margaret, they said, had been trapped between a desire for independence and an overwhelming need for safety. Vale was described as controlling but also deeply lonely, a man whose obsession had blinded him to the consequences of his actions. Some theorized that Margaret had willingly gone with Vale, seeking protection from unseen threats. Others believed that she had been coerced, manipulated into silence. Still, others feared the worst, that she had fallen victim to a violence that would never be fully uncovered. Mercer found himself haunted by these possibilities. He spent long nights revisiting interviews, piecing together timelines, and imagining the moments between them, the whispered conversations, the silences, the hidden struggles. One evening, as autumn's chill crept into the air, Mercer received a call that shifted the case once again. A local hiker had found a shallow grave near an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a site previously overlooked due to its remote location. The police were on their way. When Mercer arrived, the air was thick with a mix of hope and dread. The forensic team worked with solemn care, uncovering human remains carefully wrapped in a faded blanket. DNA tests confirmed the remains were Margaret's. The confirmation brought a terrible relief. Margaret's family was notified, and the news spread quietly through the town. There was grief, but also a measure of peace. The mystery of her disappearance had finally reached a heartbreaking conclusion, yet the questions about how and why remained unanswered. Vale was charged with her murder, though without a clear motive or confession. His demeanor did not falter during the arrest or the trial, his silence an unsettling void in the courtroom. During the proceedings, the defense painted Vale as a man misunderstood, a guardian rather than a predator. The prosecution argued that his obsession had led to tragedy. Testimonies from friends and family painted a portrait of a young woman caught in a web of manipulation and fear. The trial was lengthy, filled with emotional testimonies, expert analyses, and haunting glimpses into Margaret's final days. For the community, It was a reckoning, a painful confrontation with loss and the limits of justice. In the end, Vale was convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. His conviction brought a measure of closure, but Mercer knew the case would linger in the memories of all involved, an echo of a life cut short and a community forever changed. Margaret's story remained a quiet reminder of the fragility of trust, the dangers lurking beneath the surface of ordinary lives, and the resilience of those left behind to seek answers in the silence. The River Bend, once a place of mystery and fear, became a place of remembrance. A small plaque was placed near the water's edge, inscribed with Margaret's name and a simple message, in memory of a young woman whose light touched us all. Detective Mercer visited often, standing by the flowing water, letting the sound of the current wash over him. He thought of Margaret's words, her hopes, and the life she had fought to live. The case was closed, but the questions, the shadows, and the lingering sorrow would remain. In that quiet space between memory and loss, the story of Margaret Ellison lived on. The story of the Grim Sleeper is one of those dark, unsettling chapters in American criminal history, a quiet terror that stretched across decades, hiding in plain sight within a city's bustling neighborhoods. It is a tale woven from fragments of fear, unanswered questions, and a community's slow awakening to the reality of a predator living among them. This story is not just about the man who committed the crimes, but about the victims whose lives were shattered, the detectives who pursued elusive leads, and the fragile threads of hope that persisted amid despair. Between 1985 and 2007, a series of brutal murders and disappearances plagued Los Angeles, largely centered in the South Central and Watts neighborhoods, areas marked by poverty, resilience, and a complex social fabric. The killer's modus operandi was chillingly consistent, targeting mostly African American women, many of whom were involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction. He would stalk, attack, and murder them, often leaving their bodies in abandoned lots, alleys, or near railroad tracks. What made this case particularly haunting was the long hiatus, a gap of nearly 14 years, that came to define the killer's nickname, the Grim Sleeper. For years, the deaths were seen as tragic but isolated incidents, part of the harsh realities faced by vulnerable communities. Law enforcement struggled to connect the dots, hindered by limited resources, systemic bias, and the complex nature of the cases. But in 2007, a new break came when a missing woman, named Genesia Peters, disappeared and her remains were found months later. That case would ultimately unravel decades of silence and fear. The man at the center was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a seemingly ordinary resident of Los Angeles. Known to friends and neighbors as a family man and a handyman, Franklin lived a double life that few could have imagined. In the shadows of the city, he wove a pattern of violence that would terrorize a community and evade justice for years. The investigation into the Grim Sleeper was one marked by frustration and heartbreak. Detectives pored over evidence that was often scant, piecing together connections from witness accounts, forensic clues, and the subtle overlaps of each case. The killer's ability to blend into the urban landscape, to vanish and reappear, confounded them. There was a haunting sense that he was always one step ahead, watching from the shadows. What followed was a painstaking journey through the complexities of the criminal mind and the social dynamics that shaped the investigation. It was a story that revealed how systemic neglect and marginalization can silence victims and slow justice. But it was also a story of persistence, of detectives who refused to let the case grow cold, of families who demanded answers, and of a city grappling with its own shadows. As the truth finally emerged, the community was forced to confront painful realities about violence, race, and the cost of invisibility. The Grim Sleeper case was not just about a serial killer. It was about the fractures in society that allowed such a predator to thrive unnoticed for so long. This is the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper, and the lives forever altered by his crimes. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born in 1952 in Los Angeles, the eldest of 5 children. Raised in a modest home in South Central, he grew up during a period of significant social upheaval, with the city's neighborhoods marked by racial tensions, economic disparity, and shifting cultural landscapes. His childhood, by most accounts, was relatively ordinary, though family members later recalled moments that hinted at a troubled mind. an intensity in his eyes, episodes of anger, and a tendency toward isolation. As a young man, Franklin joined the Air Force, serving as a mechanic during the Vietnam War era. The military was a formative experience, and while he was described as a diligent worker, there were murmurs of disciplinary issues and a temper that simmered beneath the surface. Returning to civilian life, Franklin settled back into Los Angeles, taking up work as a truck driver and handyman. He married, had children, and for years presented the image of a devoted family man. Yet, behind this facade, a darker pattern emerged. Starting in the early 1980s, women began disappearing under unsettling circumstances in the neighborhoods Franklin called home. Many were vulnerable, women struggling with addiction, poverty, or involved in sex work, living on the margins where crime and survival intertwined. Their disappearances and deaths were often dismissed or overlooked by authorities and society alike. The first known victim attributed to the Grim Sleeper was Louise Petey in 1985, though some believe his crimes may have started even earlier. Petey was found strangled, her body abandoned in an alley near railroad tracks. The case bore striking similarities to others that followed: victims left in isolated places, signs of sexual assault, and evidence suggesting the killer lingered after the attack. But despite these parallels, the connection remained unrecognized for years. Over the next several years, more women vanished or were found dead in similar conditions. Among them were several young women, often known by nicknames or partial identities, making their stories harder to piece together. The victims became numbers on a list, tragic footnotes in the city's growing crime statistics. Law enforcement struggled with the investigation. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, was overwhelmed with cases, many of which involved the city's vulnerable populations. The victims, often dismissed due to their lifestyles, were not the priority they should have been. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearful of retaliation or skeptical that justice would be served. It was not until the late 1980s that the term Grim Sleeper was coined, inspired by the long period when the murders seemed to pause between 1988 and 2002. This hiatus baffled investigators, raising questions about whether the killer had stopped or simply become more cautious. During those years, Franklin's life seemed to follow a quieter course. He was raising his children, maintaining his job, and rarely drawing attention to himself. Yet, beneath the surface, the threat remained. The city's whispers about the Grim Sleeper persisted, a shadow that haunted the streets but eluded capture. In 2007, the case took a decisive turn. Janecia Peters, a 23-year-old woman from South Central, disappeared after last being seen near her home. Her remains were found months later in a remote area, sparking renewed urgency in the investigation. This disappearance broke the silence of the hiatus and brought fresh attention to the unresolved cases. Detectives from the LAPD's Homicide Division reopened files, revisiting evidence with new forensic technologies and techniques. Advances in DNA analysis offered new possibilities. Forensic experts began to piece together genetic profiles from the crime scenes, and patterns that had once been invisible started to emerge. The breakthrough came with the identification of a genetic match linking multiple crime scenes. DNA evidence tied the murders of women from the 1980s and early 2000s to a single individual, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. This revelation sent shockwaves through the department and the community. The Grim Sleeper had been living among them all along, an unassuming man whose outward normalcy masked decades of terror. The investigation intensified as officers sought to build a case. Surveillance was placed on Franklin's home, and detectives interviewed neighbors, family members and acquaintances. They uncovered a pattern of violent behavior, including previous convictions for rape and assault, which had gone largely unnoticed or unconnected to the serial killings. Franklin's arrest in 2010 was both a moment of relief and disbelief. Neighbors expressed shock that someone they had seen regularly could be responsible for such atrocities. His family struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he was accused of being. The trial that followed was a complex and emotionally charged process. Prosecutors presented a compelling case based on DNA evidence, witness testimony, and a detailed timeline linking Franklin to at least 10 murders and numerous assaults. They described a predator who stalked his victims with chilling precision,
exploiting their vulnerabilities and instilling fear in entire communities. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge the DNA evidence and portray Franklin as a victim of circumstance, but the weight of proof was overwhelming. The stories of the victims were central to the trial. Families came forward, sharing memories and photographs, voices trembling as they recounted the women's dreams, hopes, and the lives cut short. These were not just cases or statistics, they were human stories marked by love, loss, and the quest for justice. The trial illuminated broader issues of systemic neglect and racial disparity. Many questioned why it had taken so long to connect the crimes, and why the victims' lives had been marginalized for so long. Activists and community leaders called for reforms in how law enforcement approached cases involving vulnerable populations. Franklin was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death in 2016. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but left an indelible scar on Los Angeles. The Grim Sleeper's reign of terror had ended, but the echoes of his crimes continued to reverberate. Detectives reflected on the challenges of the case, the missed opportunities, the societal blind spots, and the persistent hope that had driven them forward. For many, the investigation was a reminder of the complexities of human nature, the fragility of safety, and the power of perseverance. The neighborhoods that had once been silent witnesses to tragedy began to heal slowly. Memorials were erected to honor the victims, and community programs aimed at prevention and support took root. The stories of the women were reclaimed from anonymity, given names, faces, and voices. Lonnie Franklin's story serves as a solemn reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of everyday life, and the importance of vigilance, compassion, and justice. It is a narrative marked by pain, but also by resilience, a testament to those who refuse to forget. As the sun sets over the city, casting long shadows over streets once haunted by fear, the memory of the Grim Sleeper lingers, a quiet warning and a call to remember the lives lost in the darkness. In the years following Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s arrest, the full extent of the Grim Sleeper's crimes began to unfold in a grim tapestry that revealed the depths of his cruelty and the complexities of the community's response. The investigation into his past was exhaustive, extending beyond the known victims, seeking answers to how such a predator had operated for so long without detection. The years between 1985 and 2007 were marked by a disturbing pattern of violence and disappearance, but the precise number of Franklin's victims remains uncertain. Investigators suspected more than 10 murders could be attributed to him, alongside numerous assaults, yet many cases remained unsolved or lacking sufficient evidence to be conclusively linked. The shadows he left behind blurred the line between fact and speculation, underscoring the limitations of forensic science and law enforcement at the time. The LAPD dedicated significant resources to revisiting cold cases, hoping to identify other women who might have fallen prey. Many victims shared similarities. African American women, often involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, living in the same neighborhoods Franklin had frequented. Their stories, often marginalized and unheard, began to be retold through the lens of the Grim Sleeper case, bringing overdue recognition and dignity. One of the haunting realities of the investigation was the profound mistrust between the community and law enforcement. For years, residents in South Central Los Angeles felt neglected or targeted by the police, fostering an environment where crimes against marginalized individuals were sometimes overlooked. The Grim Sleeper case became a catalyst for conversations about racial bias, policing practices, and the social structures that had enabled such violence to go undetected. Detective Russell Poole, a veteran of the LAPD Homicide Division, played a crucial role in pursuing the Grim Sleeper. His approach was methodical and patient, focused on piecing together decades-old evidence, while rebuilding connections with families and community members. Paul and his team faced a delicate balance. The need for justice had to be tempered with respect for the victims' loved ones and sensitivity to the community's wounds. In the courtroom, the prosecution laid bare the horrific details of Franklin's crimes without resorting to sensationalism. They painted a picture of a man who meticulously planned his attacks, preying on women he perceived as vulnerable and overlooked. The victims were humanized, their lives brought to the forefront through testimony, photographs, and personal stories shared by family members. This approach honored their memories and reinforced the gravity of the loss. Witnesses described the palpable fear that gripped the neighborhoods during the years of the Grim Sleeper's activity. Women lived with a constant awareness that danger lurked nearby, their movements cautious, their trust in others diminished. The killer's ability to blend into the community and evade capture fostered a chilling uncertainty. No one knew when or where he might strike next. Franklin's family history became a subject of intense scrutiny. His wife and children expressed shock and disbelief, grappling with the stark contrast between the man they knew and the crimes he was convicted of. They spoke of a quiet, reserved man who rarely discussed his work or personal life in detail. The dissonance between his domestic life and his violent acts raised difficult questions about the nature of evil and the masks people wear. Psychological experts consulted during the trial sought to understand Franklin's mindset. His behavior suggested a deeply disturbed individual, capable of compartmentalizing his life and evading detection through careful manipulation. The long period of inactivity between 1988 and 2002 was examined with particular interest. Some theorized that he may have been incarcerated or living in a way that limited his ability to commit crimes. Others believed he consciously ceased his attacks, only to resume years later with renewed ferocity. This hiatus added to the case's eerie mystique, inspiring fear and speculation among residents and investigators alike. It suggested a killer who was not only patient but calculating, perhaps even taunting the police and the community with his silence. Throughout the trial, the impact on the families of the victims remained palpable. Many had waited decades for answers, enduring years of uncertainty and grief. The courtroom became a space for their voices, a place where they could confront the past and seek closure. Their courage in sharing painful memories underscored the human cost of Franklin's crimes. The verdict, delivered in 2016, was a moment of reckoning. Franklin was found guilty of 10 counts of murder and numerous other charges, and sentenced to death. The decision was met with a mix of relief, sorrow, and reflection. For many, it marked the end of a dark chapter, but also a reminder of the failures that had allowed the Grim Sleeper to roam free for so long. In the years that followed, the Grim Sleeper case continued to resonate beyond the courtroom. It spurred initiatives aimed at improving police-community relations, particularly in underserved neighborhoods. Efforts to address the social conditions that contributed to vulnerability and violence gained momentum, highlighting the importance of prevention alongside punishment. Community organizations worked tirelessly to support families affected by violence, offering counseling, resources, and advocacy. Memorials and vigils became spaces to honor the victims and reaffirm a commitment to justice and healing. The women whose lives had been stolen were remembered not just for their tragic ends, but for their strength, resilience, and humanity. The story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper, is a somber reflection on the complexities of human nature and society. It reveals how darkness can lurk beneath familiar faces, how prejudice and neglect can obscure truth, and how perseverance and compassion can ultimately illuminate even the deepest shadows. For Los Angeles, the case was a painful lesson in vigilance and empathy. It called on the city to confront uncomfortable truths about race, poverty, and justice, to ensure that the voices of the vulnerable are never again silenced or forgotten. As the sun sets over South Central, the memory of the Grim Sleeper remains a quiet echo, a reminder of lives lost, lessons learned, and the enduring hope for a safer, more just future. The courtroom was heavy with a solemn atmosphere as the Grim Sleeper's trial drew to a close. For those who had followed the case from its painful beginnings, the anticipation of justice mingled with the exhaustion of decades-long grief. The trial itself was a painstaking journey through harrowing details, testimonies, and the stark reality of lives cut short, but it was also an exploration of resilience, of the families who sought closure and the community that had endured years of fear. Lonnie Franklin Jr. sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his expression unreadable. The years had worn on him, but there was no sign of remorse that could be seen by those in the courtroom. His defense had largely rested on challenging the evidence, questioning the DNA matches, and attempting to distance him from the string of murders. Yet, the weight of scientific proof and eyewitness accounts proved insurmountable. The prosecution meticulously recounted the timeline of Franklin's offenses, highlighting the cold, calculated nature of his crimes. They described the quiet neighborhoods, shattered by violence, the women who were stalked, assaulted and murdered. Each victim was honored through heartfelt statements from family members and survivors who had been forever changed by their experiences. These moments humanized the victims beyond their tragic ends. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Their dreams and aspirations, their struggles and joys were remembered in the solemnity of the courtroom. Throughout the trial, the defense attempted to sow doubt, emphasizing the long gap in the Grim Sleeper's known activity between 1988 and 2002. They suggested the possibility of another perpetrator or misidentification, but the prosecution countered with DNA evidence that linked Franklin to multiple crime scenes with near certainty. Additionally, advances in forensic technology had been pivotal, allowing investigators to bridge decades and bring clarity to cold cases that once seemed beyond reach. One of the most striking elements was the impact on the community. South Central Los Angeles had been deeply scarred by the Grim Sleeper's reign of terror. Residents spoke openly about the pervasive fear and the mistrust that had grown between them and law enforcement. Many recounted how women adjusted their daily routines, avoiding walking alone, not answering the door to strangers, and holding their loved ones close. This collective trauma lingered long after Franklin's capture, shaping the social fabric of the neighborhoods affected. Yet, in the midst of sorrow and fear, there was a powerful sense of hope and healing. Community leaders, activists and families came together to demand better protection, resources, and recognition for victims of violent crime, especially those marginalized by race and class. The Grim Sleeper case became a catalyst for change, shining a light on systemic issues that had allowed violence to flourish unchecked. Franklin's family, too, grappled with the enormity of his crimes. His wife and children were thrust into the media spotlight, confronted with the staggering contrast between the man they thought they knew and the atrocities he was convicted of committing. They expressed disbelief and sorrow, struggling to reconcile personal memories with the chilling reality revealed in court. Their pain was a poignant reminder of the ripple effects of such violence, how it touches not only direct victims, but also those closest to the perpetrator. Psychological experts testified about Franklin's complex profile. He was described as a man capable of extreme compartmentalization, able to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing heinous acts in secret. His long dormant period was the subject of analysis. Some believed he may have been incarcerated for unrelated offenses or otherwise constrained. Others suggested he deliberately ceased his attacks, a calculated pause before resuming. This behavior added layers to understanding the Grim Sleeper's mindset, portraying him as a patient, cold predator rather than a reckless or impulsive killer. The trial also confronted uncomfortable questions about societal neglect. The victims' profiles, mostly African American women struggling with poverty, addiction and involvement in sex work, often rendered them invisible to society at large. Their disappearances and deaths were initially met with indifference or skepticism, reflecting broader systemic failures. The Grim Sleeper case forced a reckoning, emphasizing that every life holds value, and every victim deserves justice and remembrance. As closing arguments concluded, the judge reminded the jury of their solemn duty to weigh the evidence with impartiality and care. The jury retired to deliberate, carrying the immense responsibility of deciding the fate of a man who had terrorized a community for decades. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Franklin was found guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder and multiple related charges. The gravity of the sentence reflected not only the magnitude of his crimes, but also the years of pain endured by families and communities. He was sentenced to death, though appeals and legal processes would follow in the years to come. In the aftermath, many grappled with complex emotions. For some, the verdict was a measure of closure, a final chapter in a story that had haunted their lives. For others, it was a solemn reminder of the fragility of safety, and the enduring scars left by violence. Families continued to mourn, their losses irrevocable, but they also found solace in the recognition of their loved ones and the pursuit of justice. The Grim Sleeper's capture and conviction sparked conversations beyond courtrooms and headlines. It inspired renewed calls for better community policing, improved support for vulnerable populations, and more effective tools for solving cold cases. It underscored the need for empathy and vigilance, urging society not to overlook the marginalized or dismiss their suffering. South Central Los Angeles began to heal slowly, scarred but resilient. Memorials were erected to honor the victims, serving as places of remembrance and reflection. Community programs aimed at empowering women and combating violence gained momentum, fueled by a shared determination to prevent future tragedies. The story of the Grim Sleeper remains a haunting chapter in the city's history, a story of darkness and cruelty, but also of courage, persistence, and the enduring human spirit. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about society, justice, and the capacity for both good and evil within us all. In the quiet streets where fear once ruled, there is now a cautious hope. The legacy of those lost is not forgotten. Their names echo in the efforts to build safer, kinder communities. And while the Grim Sleeper's shadow may linger, it is met with a steadfast light, the light of remembrance, justice, and the unwavering commitment to never let such darkness go unchallenged again.
The story begins in the early 1970s, in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. The city was growing, its streets filled with hopeful families and the gentle hum of everyday life. Yet beneath the surface, a shadow was quietly gathering, one that would soon ripple through communities with a mixture of confusion, fear, and grief. Wayne Williams was a young man in his mid-20s, known to those who knew him as intelligent and charismatic. He worked in music promotion, a world filled with vibrant energy and social connections. His friends described him as personable and confident, someone who could navigate different social circles with ease. But behind that exterior lay complexities that few would come to understand. The first disappearances began quietly. Young African-American men and boys started vanishing from neighborhoods around Atlanta. At first, their absences were thought to be isolated incidents, teenagers running away, or young men moving for work or school. But as months passed, the pattern became undeniable. Bodies were found in wooded areas, near rivers, or discarded in places that spoke of hurried desperation. The community was shaken, but the police struggled to find leads. The victims shared certain similarities. Most were young black males, aged between their mid-teens and early 20s. Their lives were cut short in violent, often brutal ways. The killings felt random, yet the growing number of victims created an undeniable connection. Families waited in anguish, unanswered questions piling as police investigations seemed to stall. Wayne Williams soon became a person of interest. In a city already grappling with racial tensions and distrust toward law enforcement, his connection to some victims and his presence in the area drew attention. He was arrested in 1981, charged with 2 of the murders. The trial that followed would uncover dark truths and ignite intense debate. Through careful investigation, the authorities built a case relying heavily on fiber evidence and circumstantial links. The forensic science of the time was limited compared to modern standards, but the fibers found on victims matched those found in Williams' home and car. Witnesses placed him near some crime scenes, weaving a narrative that pointed toward guilt. Yet the community's response was complex. Many believed that Williams was guilty, seeing him as the man responsible for a string of devastating losses. Others feared that racial bias and pressure to solve the case might lead to a miscarriage of justice. The trial became a focal point for broader conversations about race policing and the value placed on black lives. The courtroom was filled with tense anticipation as evidence was presented, the prosecution meticulously recounting the timeline and details of the murders. The defense painted a different picture, questioning the reliability of the fiber evidence, suggesting alternative suspects, and emphasizing the lack of direct witnesses. Ultimately, Wayne Williams was convicted of 2 murders, but suspected by police of being responsible for many more. The case was officially closed, Yet the debate over his guilt and the full extent of the killings remains a point of discussion to this day. This story is not only about one man, but about a community's struggle to understand and heal from a series of profound tragedies. It raises questions about justice, the limits of forensic science, and the ways society responds to violence against marginalized groups. The Atlanta child murders, as they came to be known, left an indelible mark on the city's history. The victims' names, their faces, and their stories linger in the collective memory, reminding us that behind every statistic is a human life, filled with dreams, fears, and love. As this story unfolds, we will explore the lives affected, the investigations that tried to unravel the mystery, and the lasting impact on Atlanta and beyond. In the years leading up to Wayne Williams's arrest, Atlanta was a city on edge. The peaceful facade of its neighborhoods was fractured by a creeping sense of dread, the kind that settled in slowly but refused to dissipate. For the families of the missing boys and young men, each day without news was a fresh wound, a reminder that their loved ones had vanished without explanation, leaving behind unanswered questions and broken hearts. The early 1970s marked the beginning of what would become a string of disappearances that bewildered residents and baffled law enforcement. The victims were predominantly African American males between the ages of 7 and 21, many of whom had ties to the city's poorer neighborhoods. These young men were sons, brothers, friends, individuals with hopes, struggles, and the quiet dignity of ordinary life. Some of the missing had been seen walking alone at night. Others were last spotted near bus stops or local parks. Families described how the boys were often waiting for rides, or simply passing through areas they had always considered safe. But safety, it seemed, had been compromised. Rumors began to swirl, and fear permeated community conversations. Parents cautioned their children to avoid walking alone after dark, and neighborhoods began to feel unfamiliar, even hostile. As more bodies were found, the scale of the tragedy became clear. The victims had been strangled, often with such force that the physical violence spoke of rage or control. Many bodies were discovered in wooded areas near the Chattahoochee River, or dumped near freeway underpasses, places where the urban landscape met wild, neglected spaces. The grim discovery of these bodies was a haunting ritual, each new one revealing the extent of the violence that had been lurking in the shadows. Police investigations struggled to keep pace with the growing list of victims. At first, the cases were treated individually, with little connection drawn between them. Law enforcement agencies lacked the resources and experience to manage what was unfolding as a pattern of serial killings. The victims, largely from marginalized communities, were often overlooked in media coverage and official urgency. This neglect added to the pain of families who felt their loved ones were disappearing not only from their homes but from the city's conscience. Wayne Williams entered the picture in this fraught context. Born in 1958, Williams grew up in Atlanta and had a background that set him apart in some ways. He was well educated, attending college and working in music promotion, a field that brought him into contact with creative circles and nightlife. To those who knew him, Williams was articulate and socially adept, qualities that masked a darker dimension that only emerged as police investigations advanced. His connection to the case began to take shape in 1981, after the bodies of two men, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, were found in the Chattahoochee River. These victims, like many others, had been strangled and left in the water. Police surveillance led them to Williams, who was seen near the area around the time of the murders. Under increasing scrutiny, Williams was arrested and charged with their deaths. The investigation revealed a mix of forensic and circumstantial evidence, linking Williams to multiple crime scenes. Fiber analysis, a relatively new forensic technique at the time, played a critical role. Scientists compared fibers found on the victim's clothing to those from Williams' home and car, noting similarities that suggested contact. This evidence became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, though it also sparked controversy over its reliability and interpretation. The trial was a tense, polarizing event. Families of victims sought justice, hoping that the man in the defendant's chair was truly responsible for the pain that had plagued their lives. Yet, Doubts and debates permeated the courtroom and the city beyond. Defense attorneys argued that the fiber evidence was inconclusive, and that the case rested largely on assumption rather than direct proof. They presented alternative theories, including the possibility of other suspects who had not been thoroughly investigated. Media coverage reflected these tensions, with some outlets portraying Williams as a monster who had preyed on innocent youth, while others highlighted the complexities of the case and the challenges faced by law enforcement. The racial dynamics of the city also influenced public perception. Atlanta was still grappling with the legacy of segregation and inequality, and the trial underscored the fraught relationship between the African American community and the police. Psychologists and experts testified about the nature of serial killers, trying to provide insight into the behavior and motivations behind the crimes. They described how some killers carefully choose victims who they believe won't attract widespread attention, and how they operate in ways that exploit social blind spots. This analysis resonated with many, especially given the long period over which the murders occurred and the lack of early intervention. The trial also shed light on the broader societal issues that had allowed these crimes to continue. Many of the victims had been vulnerable, involved in unstable home environments, struggling with economic hardship, or living on the margins of society. The failures to protect them reflected systemic neglect and underscored the need for greater community support and awareness. Throughout the proceedings, Williams maintained a composed demeanor, presenting himself as confident and articulate. He denied involvement in the murders, asserting that the evidence was circumstantial and insufficient. Despite this, the jury found him guilty of the 2 murders he was charged with, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, the question of whether Williams was responsible for all the killings remained a source of debate. Police officially attributed the majority of the Atlanta child murders to Williams, citing patterns of victimology, modus operandi, and geographic connections. Yet some family members and independent observers continued to question if others might have been involved, or if the true scope of the crimes was fully understood. These uncertainties contributed to an ongoing conversation about justice and truth. In the years following the conviction, efforts to revisit the cases continued. Advances in DNA technology and forensic science opened possibilities for new examinations of evidence, though many cases remained unresolved. The families of victims sought closure, often organizing memorials and advocacy groups to keep the memories of their loved ones alive. Atlanta itself changed in the wake of these events. The murders and the trial exposed deep wounds, but also prompted reflection on how communities and institutions address violence and vulnerability. The city invested in programs aimed at youth safety, community policing, and support services, hoping to prevent such tragedies from happening again. The story of Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders remains a haunting chapter in American history, a tale marked by loss, complexity, and the difficult search for justice. It serves as a reminder that behind every headline and statistic are real people, whose lives ripple outward in ways that shape families and communities for generations. In the quiet moments that followed the trial, the echoes of those lost continued to linger, their voices carried on by those who remember and who refuse to let their stories fade into silence. The conviction of Wayne Williams did not mark the end of the pain or the questions for the families and the city of Atlanta. Though he was found guilty of 2 murders, law enforcement linked him to more than 20 of the victims, making him one of America's most infamous suspected serial killers. Yet the case remained layered with complexities, shadows of doubt, and unresolved grief. Following Williams' trial and conviction in 1982, the families of the victims were left grappling with a mix of relief and skepticism. Relief because there was finally a face held accountable for some of the murders that had haunted their lives. Skepticism because many questioned whether justice had been fully served. Was Wayne Williams truly responsible for all the disappearances and deaths? Were there others involved? Could some of the victims have been overlooked or forgotten in the rush to find closure? The investigation into the Atlanta child murders was among the largest and most intense in the history of the city. Police dedicated countless hours and resources to the case,
But even with such efforts, they were not able to fully explain the entire pattern of violence. The evidence that linked Williams to some victims was compelling: fiber analysis, witness testimony, and his proximity to crime scenes. But for others, the connections were more tenuous. Over time, debates about the scope of Williams' culpability grew, fueled in part by inconsistencies and gaps in the investigation. One of the enduring questions centers around the forensic evidence itself. The fiber analysis used to tie Williams to the murders was groundbreaking at the time, but by modern standards it lacked the precision of DNA testing. Fibers are not unique identifiers in the way genetic material is, and defense experts raised concerns about contamination, the interpretation of the evidence, and the potential for coincidental matches. While the prosecution argued that the fibers found on victims' clothing, such as carpet and dog hair, matched those in Williams's environment, the defense countered that these materials were common and did not definitively prove contact. Years later, with the advent of DNA technology, some efforts were made to re-examine evidence from the case, but limitations in preservation and collection hindered progress. Without clear biological evidence linking Williams to all of the murders, the debate over his full responsibility persisted. Some believe that he acted alone, methodically and cruelly targeting vulnerable young men. Others suspect that there may have been accomplices, or even multiple perpetrators exploiting the fear that gripped Atlanta. This uncertainty added to the burden borne by families who lived with an unanswerable question: did the man in prison truly account for their loved one's death, or did the full truth remain hidden? For some families, the conviction was a form of justice, a tangible response to years of anguish. For others, it was a reminder of the limitations of the criminal justice system and the lingering gaps in understanding. Wayne Williams himself continued to assert his innocence regarding the majority of the murders. During appeals and interviews, he maintained that he was wrongly accused, a victim of circumstantial evidence and racial bias. His arguments, however, were met with skepticism by the courts, which upheld his conviction. He remains imprisoned, serving multiple life sentences without parole. Beyond the legal and forensic aspects, the psychological dimension of the case offers profound insights. Williams' profile suggested a complex individual who could blend charm with violence. Experts described him as someone capable of manipulating social situations, which helped him avoid early suspicion. His ability to navigate different communities, and perhaps even to gain the trust of some victims or their families, added a chilling layer to the narrative. The impact on Atlanta's community cannot be overstated. The city, once known for its hospitality and growth, was marred by a string of brutal crimes that exposed fault lines of race, poverty, and social neglect. Trust between law enforcement and the African American community was strained, complicated by the perception that early warnings and missing persons reports had been dismissed or minimized. As the years passed, memorials and foundations arose in honor of the victims. Family members became advocates, speaking publicly about their children and brothers, striving to keep their memories alive. The Atlanta Child Murders Foundation was established to support families and promote awareness about missing and exploited children. These efforts reflected a determination not to let the victims be forgotten in history, or overshadowed by the sensational aspects of the case. In the wider cultural context, the Atlanta child murders influenced discussions about serial killers, victimology, and the intersection of crime and society. It highlighted how certain victims, particularly those from marginalized communities, can be overlooked or rendered invisible in media and public consciousness. The case also showed how advances in forensic science could shape investigations, for better and for worse, as new technologies replaced older methods and brought renewed scrutiny to past convictions. Atlanta's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of haste and assumption in criminal cases. While police and prosecutors were eager to solve the case and bring closure, critics argue that some aspects of the investigation were rushed or inadequately pursued, leading to unresolved questions. This has led to calls for continued review and transparency in cold cases nationwide, emphasizing the importance of thoroughness and the rights of the accused alongside the needs of victims' families. Williams's imprisonment is not the final chapter for many affected. Families have sought exoneration, new leads and justice for each individual lost. Some advocate for reopening unsolved cases that occurred during the same period, hoping that modern investigative tools might shed light on the truth. For the broader public, the Atlanta child murders remain a haunting episode that challenges assumptions about safety, community, and justice. The image of young lives lost, boys who should have been stepping into adulthood, full of promise, lingers. Their stories serve as a solemn reminder that beneath the surface of any city, shadows may hide, and that vigilance, compassion, and justice are ongoing commitments. Despite the darkness of the crimes, the resilience of the families and communities stands out. Their efforts to remember, to advocate, and to seek truth demonstrate a refusal to let pain define them entirely. The legacy of the Atlanta child murders is in part a call to recognize the humanity in every victim and to confront the uncomfortable realities that allow such tragedies to happen. Through all of this, Wayne Williams remains a figure wrapped in contradiction, a man whose guilt in 2 murders is beyond doubt, but whose role in the full pattern of killings is debated. His story intertwines with those of the victims, the families, the investigators, and the city itself, creating a complex tapestry of tragedy and resilience. In the end, the Atlanta child murders force us to consider how we respond to loss, how we seek justice, and how we remember those who are taken from us too soon. It is a story that echoes beyond the courtroom, into the hearts of those left behind, and into the collective conscience of a community striving to heal. The aftermath of Wayne Williams' conviction left Atlanta grappling with a complicated legacy, one marked by grief, skepticism, and a lingering search for truth. While the city had hoped the trial would bring closure to the mysterious and brutal string of murders that had plagued its neighborhoods for years, the reality proved far more complex and haunting. Williams was convicted in 1982 for the murders of 2 adult men, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, whose bodies were found in the Chattahoochee River. These cases were central to the prosecution's argument, supported by fiber evidence and witness accounts placing Williams near the crime scenes. Yet the other 20 or more murders, mostly of young African American boys and teenagers, were never formally charged against him, leaving open questions about whether justice had been fully served. The families of the victims faced an uncertain future. Some expressed relief that a man had been held accountable, believing that Williams was responsible for the broader pattern of killings. Others remained unconvinced, haunted by unanswered questions and the absence of definitive evidence linking Williams to their loved ones. For many, the trial did not end the pain, it only reframed it in legal terms, leaving wounds exposed and new doubts in their place. Within law enforcement, the case had been a monumental undertaking. The Atlanta Police Department had devoted immense resources to the investigation, coordinating with the FBI and other agencies. The case marked a turning point in forensic science, as investigators employed fiber analysis in ways never before seen in American criminal investigations. Fibers from Williams' home, car, and dog were matched to those found on several victims, a novel form of circumstantial evidence that helped build the case. However, the science was still in its infancy, and critics would later question the reliability and interpretation of these findings. In the courtroom, the prosecution portrayed Williams as a cunning predator, someone who targeted vulnerable young men, exploiting social and racial dynamics to evade suspicion. His ability to blend into the community, to appear as a normal, even charismatic individual, added a chilling dimension to his profile. Psychologists and criminologists analyzed his behavior, noting patterns of control, manipulation, and violence consistent with what would now be recognized as a serial offender's modus operandi. But even as the prosecution's narrative gained traction, voices of dissent emerged. Defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and flawed, relying heavily on forensic techniques that lacked scientific consensus. They suggested that Williams had been a convenient scapegoat in a city desperate for answers, caught in the crosshairs of racial tensions and public fear. These arguments fueled public debate, particularly among Atlanta's African American community, which felt the investigation had been uneven, at times dismissive of victims and their families. The conviction did not put an end to the violence in Atlanta. Shortly after Williams' arrest, a few more victims were found, raising the disturbing possibility that there may have been other perpetrators, or that the killings had been part of a larger, more complicated pattern. The police never officially reopened the broader investigation to include other suspects, but independent researchers and journalists continued to probe the case, seeking clarity. As years passed, the city of Atlanta moved forward, but carried the scars of the child murders. Memorials and vigils became a way to honor the victims' memories, offering families and the community spaces for mourning and remembrance. The Atlanta Child Murders Foundation was formed to support survivors and raise awareness about missing and exploited children, a lasting legacy born from tragedy. On a deeper level, the case exposed systemic issues, racial inequality, poverty and social neglect, that created environments where vulnerable children were more at risk. It also highlighted tensions between law enforcement and the community, emphasizing the need for trust, transparency, and cultural sensitivity in investigations. Wayne Williams' life behind bars has been a study in contradictions. He has consistently maintained his innocence regarding many of the murders, insisting that the evidence was circumstantial and his conviction unjust. Appeals and petitions for retrial have been denied, with courts reaffirming the validity of the original verdict. Still, his claims, combined with ongoing skepticism from parts of the public and experts, have kept the conversation alive. Psychological profiles of Williams paint a portrait of a man capable of both charm and menace. His ability to evade early suspicion may have been tied to a facade of normalcy, a calculated persona that allowed him to move within different social circles unnoticed. For many who knew him, the conviction was difficult to reconcile with the image of the man they had encountered in everyday life, adding layers of complexity to the story. The family's voices remain central to this history. Many have become advocates for justice reform and support for victims' families, turning their pain into action. Their efforts reflect a determination to keep the memory of their loved ones alive beyond headlines and courtrooms, emphasizing the humanity behind each lost life. The Atlanta child murders also had a profound impact on the development of forensic science and investigative practices. The use of fiber evidence paved the way for more advanced forensic methodologies, including DNA analysis, which would revolutionize criminal justice in subsequent decades. Yet the case serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of forensic science when used in isolation or without rigorous standards. In the end, the Atlanta child murders stand as a somber chapter in American criminal history, an episode marked by deep sorrow, unresolved questions, and a search for meaning in the face of loss. Wayne Williams remains a central figure, convicted of 2 murders but forever linked to a larger pattern of violence that shaped the city's collective memory. The story is not simply one of crime and punishment, but of community, resilience, and the enduring quest for truth. It reminds us that behind every statistic is a person, a family, and a community forever changed. The shadows cast by these events linger, inviting reflection on the fragility of safety and the complexities of justice. Atlanta's legacy, shaped by these tragedies, challenges us to listen to the victims, to the families, and to the history that continues to unfold in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The story of Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders is not easily resolved. It resists simple answers, offering instead a profound meditation on loss, memory, and the enduring human need for justice and understanding. Through decades of pain and perseverance, the city and its people have sought to honor the children who were taken too soon, to learn from the past, and to build a future where such darkness might be prevented. It is a reminder that true justice is often complex and incomplete, requiring patience, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Though Wayne Williams sits behind bars, the echoes of those years still ripple through Atlanta. The names of the victims, whispered in remembrance, carry the weight of lives interrupted and futures lost. Their stories are threads woven into the fabric of the city, a silent testament to the shadows that once loomed and the light that strives to emerge. The Atlanta child murders remain a haunting and unresolved legacy, a story that continues to teach us about the costs of fear, the power of resilience, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to forget. It is a story not only of a man and his crimes, but of a community forever changed, and the enduring hope that justice, in all its forms, might someday be complete.